Thank you, Mr. Chair. In 2017, the Republican theory was cut taxes on large corporations and cut taxes on the profits they make overseas, and hope those companies will put their increased profits into new investments. In 21 and 22, we took a different direction. We invested in the nation's infrastructure. We invested in manufacturing, in industries that are poised to promote good jobs in the future, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, and others. I'm a former mayor and governor, which means I still kind of think of myself as an economic developer, so I'm making pitches all the time to companies about why to come to Virginia. I'm on the phone at least once a week with some company trying to make a pitch. I was on the phone with a company yesterday who's really excited about some of the clean energy provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other investments in the infrastructure bill. Talk about these two visions, that, cut taxes and count on companies making more to help grow the economy versus direct investment, infrastructure, and manufacturing. It's going to be a great case study. It may take another 10 or 15 years for people to really write the case study, but if I could begin with you, Dr. Clausing, talk about these two visions for growing the economy and growing prosperity for everyday Americans.
Yes, I think when we saw the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act enacted, there was a big debate about whether it would pay for itself, which it didn't, whether it would spur a new renaissance in wage growth and investment, which it did not. There was a lot of evidence that it increased shareholder value in the run-up to the legislation. The stock market soared. It increased buybacks a lot, but there was very little discernible effect on aggregate investment in the United States, and I think that was partly because of the fact that a lot of this tax cut was directed at these excess profits. So when you cut someone's taxes on their excess profits and they have extra money, they're already undertaking all the investments that they thought were rational to take. And so when you look at the benefits from that legislation, study after study has found that it mostly enriched shareholders and it didn't really trickle down to the typical worker. I think the vision of more recent legislation, starting with the infrastructure bill, it was a bipartisan bill, but also the CHIPS Act, which was bipartisan, and the Inflation Reduction Act, these are more about, I would call them a more modern supply side economics, or Secretary Yellen calls it that, so I'm really borrowing that term from her, in the sense that it's focused on really investing in the fundamentals of the United States, focusing on the people, the infrastructure, building up the United States to have those fundamental strengths so that we can compete in the world economy. And to be a fundamentally strong economy, we need adequate tax revenue to pay for these kinds of investments, which I think Mr. Hausman pointed to as well. So I think those types of investments are very useful in making our businesses work well if they have the infrastructure and the human capital that they need.
And Mr. Hausman, from workers' standpoint, and I'm proud to be a senator from a state where the largest steelworkers union in the International is located at our shipyard in Newport News. Talk about these two strategies, cutting corporate taxes versus investing in infrastructure and manufacturing, and how they affect working people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, historical precedent when we did rural electrification, when we've now trying to do that with broadband expansion across the country, I mean, it gets people into the economy, gets them productive, gets them active, and it gives them the opportunity to participate in their democracy. And I think that that's ultimately one of the key pieces here when we talk about these direct investments towards communities in need. The idea, maybe I'm a little old school, where I think it's important that every child gets every meal, and that everyone doesn't have to fret about the bills. And when we do direct investment and encourage good quality jobs, unionized jobs, we create an incentive out there in the economy that is so much more powerful than a corporate tax cut for the wealthiest people.
Just one thing before I hand it back to you, Mr. Chair. I remember the evening we voted on the bill in 2017, we got handed the bill, and we're told we had to vote on it right away. Most of us hadn't seen it. It still had handwritten interlineations that were hard to decipher. And then we got a chance to make amendments where we could speak for 1 minute and then have a vote on an amendment. My corporations in Virginia, they liked the notion the corporate tax was going down, but they weren't asking for it at 21. They were saying, can you do it at 25 or 26? And so I proposed an amendment that night, recognizing that the corporate tax cuts in the proposal were permanent, but the individual tax cuts were temporary. I said, why don't you just take the corporate tax rate, if you're going to do it and you're going to drop it to 25 or 26, and then make the individual tax cuts permanent. And that got roundly voted down by my Republican colleagues, demonstrating that the preference was not to really assist the individuals in the tax code, but to assist corporations. I still don't know that it would have been that great a bill, but it would have been a lot better bill if we had rebalanced it more to focus on individuals rather than on corporations. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Kaine.
Post-exertional malaise is the downstream effect of exercise, and I think exercise and movement will improve when we manage the upstream drivers of post-exertional malaise.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield. Thank you all.
Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate the witnesses being here. You know, I think it's an honor to testify before the United States Senate. Can also be a hassle, but for y'all, it's an additional burden. It's a burden to come, and as Ms. Beal testified, or as Ms. Vasquez traveling across the United States, or Ms. Heim here with family, you know, you're going to suffer a consequence from having been here today, likely fatigue, and so we don't have a lot of witnesses who have to come over the mountain the way you've had to be here, and I really appreciate it. And I've been dealing with my own long COVID issue for almost 4 years. It's mild, thank goodness. I feel like every nerve ending in my body's in an Alka-Seltzer 24/7. And it is, I can work, I can focus, I can exercise. It's harder to sleep. After 6 months and it not going away, I finally decided, I guess maybe it's not going to. I should see a neurologist, and I have been able to be told this is probably not going to get worse, and it's probably not going to get better, and both have proven true. Two other colleagues, one a former colleague, Senator Inhofe, and a current colleague, Senator Young, we wrote a piece about our own experiences together that I'd like to introduce into the record, if I might, Mr. Chair. And the reason that we wrote it is, Ms. Vasquez, you pointed out, and I think subsequent testimony is underlined, long COVID is disproportionately affecting people of color. Long COVID is disproportionately affecting women. But, you know, we're three white guys. One got long COVID in his 40s, Senator Young. One got long COVID in his 60s, Senator Kaine. One got long COVID in his 80s, Senator Inhofe. And we decided, after kind of finding ourselves on the floor of the Senate, bumming around and wondering if anyone else is having this weird experience we are, we found each other and shared our experiences. And I think the reason that we all started to be public about it is we didn't like that you weren't being believed. U.S. senators get believed. You know, well, by a certain percentage of the population. I didn't have trouble getting believed by a doctor. I didn't have trouble getting believed by a doctor. And I don't think Senator Inhofe did. I don't think Senator Young did. Our physical reports of our own conditions were given credibility, but so often with women, that's not the case. With minorities, that's not the case. With young people, it's not the case. We've seen the similar phenomenon in maternal mortality when we've had hearings about this. And so we decided, the three of us, to talk about our experiences so that people would understand they're being believed. And Mr. Chair, by doing this hearing today, we can approach some substantive improvements, but also I think doing a hearing like this as a way of sending a message that people are believed. Ms. Beal, I don't want you to say more than you comfortably feel like you can, but can you talk a little bit about this SSDI ordeal and that you've been, I mean, the ADA says long COVID is a condition, a disabling condition that can be one that would either require reasonable accommodations or lead to an SSDI disability determination. But in a situation where you're already low energy, you're going through an extended process where you've already been denied twice. Talk a little bit about how frustrating that might be. And you're a human resources professional who've helped employees do this, so imagine if you hadn't had that background, how frustrating this would be.
Thank you for your question, Senator. It has been an ordeal, like you said. The whole process has been very frustrating. The system is very difficult to navigate. You know, when I'm working on the paperwork, it's very overwhelming, and I can only work on it, but for so long. I set like a little timer for about 30 minutes because if I go over that, I start getting headaches. So, I'm trying to compile all of my medical documentation to send in. And, both times I was denied, SSDI doesn't give specific reasons why you were denied. So I don't know what it is that they need from me to show that I can't work.
So you don't know whether it's we don't think you're disabled, or you didn't fill out this piece of information right, or you left something blank, or you really don't know.
Right. I don't know if they were able to get in contact with all the doctors. I don't know unless the doctor tells me.
Here's a class of folks with long COVID who really have problems with the SSDI. A lot of people got COVID before we had tests. You remember how hard it was to get tested early on? And people who were getting COVID at the front end, they weren't even getting tested for COVID because there weren't tests. And then later, okay, maybe they get a vaccine, and then later a test will show that they have antibodies in their body, but that could be because of the vaccine, or it could be because they've already had COVID. And the medical professionals who are trying to make a resolution about SSDI are like, well, you have antibodies, but that doesn't mean you had COVID. So there's a set of problems that make this, within the SSDI framework, really tough. Now, we've dealt with situations like that in other contexts where we've had presumptive determinations, for availability of healthcare benefits when firefighters get certain diseases that are, because of conditions that are likely to occur in their profession. We give them presumptions that can be rebutted if they're not true, but it is a difficult proof burden, especially on somebody who's really suffering continuous symptoms of the kind you describe. And I hope I'm at my time and over it. And I want to let my colleagues go, but I hope that might be something we could focus some attention on.
Good point. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Congratulations to the witnesses. 3 topics I want to raise. First, to follow up on Senator Booker on the Gaza humanitarian situation, Mr. Plitt. The need for Israel to defend itself against an organization pledged to its destruction is clear. But what we're watching here is the effort in Gaza a defense against Hamas, or is it a war against Gazans or Palestinians? And we're looking at the evidence, and we look at rhetoric, and we look at civilian casualties, and we look at humanitarian aid, and we look at discussions about the future of Palestinian self-autonomy. And the evidence is troubling in terms of answering the question. It troubles a lot of us. To me, the clearest bit of evidence where positive changes could make the biggest difference is in the humanitarian space. Civilian casualties, because of the way Hamas embeds with civilians, very, very challenging. But the effort to get aid to 2.2 million people who've suffered under Hamas, that would be the quickest way that Israel could demonstrate this is about defeating Hamas. It's not about hurting Gazans or Palestinians. And my colleagues and I have been extremely disappointed about the pace, about the quantity of aid. And when we talk to our own, U.S. officials in the region, you mentioned Ambassador Satterfield, they're not happy about it either. Things that shouldn't be hard to get agreement on, open the Kerem Shalom border crossing, are incredibly difficult. They take way too long, and then that leads to really difficult challenges for 2.2 million people, again, who've largely suffered under Hamas. And so I just want to underline an exclamation point, this notion that humanitarian aid and hostage release, I think, are the 2 kind of highest priorities in this, and they're connected. Hostage release in the past came with a cessation of hostilities, and that led more humanitarian aid to be able to easily be distributed. So I think the effort on this committee is going to be very focused on this humanitarian aid question, and obviously your role with USAID will put you right in the middle of that. Ms. O'Donnell, I just want to say a word about UNESCO. Senator Ricketts asked you the questions about how hard UNESCO's history has been, the double standard applied to Israel. We would want our UN bodies to call out bad behavior if they see it, but the double standard applied to Israel compared to other nations has been so obvious. And yet, when the U.S. is absent from the institutions like the UN Human Rights Council or UNESCO, it gets worse. When we absented ourselves from these institutions, I had a meeting once with Michelle Bachelet when she was the human rights commissioner, and she said, look, is there a double standard? There's a double standard. It's outrageous. But when the U.S. is absent, it gets worse and worse and worse. And when the U.S. comes and is back at the table, it may still not be to our liking, it gets better. UNESCO hosted a conference on anti-Semitism in October, just a few months ago. They wouldn't have done that in the past. They're doing that now. Europe was wanting them to do it as well as the United States. But as frustrating as these institutions are, and do stand strong for our principles and stand strong for support for democratic allies, stand strong for human rights, stand strong with Israel against the double standard, it's probably not going to be to your liking, but your standing strong will move the center of the dialogue in a better place. So I would encourage you. And then finally, Madam Ambassador, I'm intrigued / worried about the upcoming elections in Indonesia, just from what I'm reading. So Indonesia has a president who can't run for another term because of term limits. The president's son is running for vice president. The Indonesian constitution says presidents and vice presidents have to be 40 years old, but the president's son is 36 years old, and the Constitutional Court, I gather, has rendered a ruling that he is qualified to run for vice president. We have a similar provision in the U.S. Constitution. There's parts of the Constitution, like what is due process, that are vague. What is cruel and unusual punishment? That's vague. But you got to be 35 years old is about the clearest thing in the Constitution. So how am I to understand a constitutional ruling in a nation that has a 40-year-old age limit for VP saying that a 36-year-old meets the qualification?
So you spoke correctly. The Constitutional Court made a decision. I am not an expert in Indonesian constitutional law, but there was a decision that allowed the current president's oldest son to run as vice president with the current defense minister. And there has been follow-up. There is another process where that is investigated, and there was a decision related to that, but that there was also a decision that since this had already happened, that this would continue on. So he is running as vice president.
Well, it's obviously troubling. I mean, I credit everything you said about the importance of the relationship and even about improvements in the relationship, which I think are notable, and that should be celebrated. But a nation that would casually cast aside a clear constitutional command about who can run and who can't run, that should at least be a red flag for us. And in terms of your priorities, should you be confirmed, promoting rule of law and democracy, I think should climb the ladder. Thank you.
I agree, Senator.
Senator Kaine, the sponsor of the LIFT Act and the Fair Housing Improvement Act.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. This is a very important topic. Since we are in a discussion sort of about macroeconomic trends, I do think it's important to mention the set of articles that have just come out in the last few days, exemplified by one in the Washington Post, January 28, from David Lynch, that I'd like to add to the record. Falling inflation, rising growth give the U.S. the world's best recovery. There are economic challenges, but one of the ways to look at these challenges and how is to look at how other nations, Europe, Canada, Mexico, Japan, China, have dealt with COVID and post-COVID. And the assessment is that the U.S. has done the best job in coming out of COVID. And not that every economic issue is solved, but in terms of inflation going down and the recovery dramatically stronger than what was predicted, dramatically stronger than other nations, there's a lot to be said for the policy actions that have been taken by Congress in order to help the U.S. have this strong economic recovery. Now, on housing, I was a fair housing lawyer for 18 years before I got into state politics, and so this is a topic that's very, very close. I was also a local elected official and a governor dealing with the LIHTC, LIHTC, dealing with home funding and knowing how important it is. During my time now, nearly 30 years on July 1 in elected office from the local, state, and federal levels, I go around the state and talk to a lot of people, and I will say the cost of housing usually would be in the top 10 over much of my career and in the top 3 in Northern Virginia, but now it's top 5 everywhere in Virginia. I could go to the most rural parts of my Commonwealth or Northern Virginia, it's going to be a top 5 or a top 3 issue. So this is a significant one, and I would say particularly for first-time home buyers. The chairman put some stats in about that I think are important. The percentage of purchases that are first-time home buyers has been going down, and so we need to figure it out. One of the things I'm real concerned about are obstacles and barriers within housing that enable people, even if they could afford housing, to find obstacles in their way. And so I want to ask about a particular bill that I've been working on, the Fair Housing Improvement Act. The Housing Choice Voucher Program provides rental assistance to allow families to find rentals that work for them. There are other programs like Section 8 vouchers. VA has some housing choice vouchers. And in theory, families can use this assistance to move to neighborhoods of their choice and get access to schools, get access to transit, get access to jobs. However, what we find is many landlords and those who have rental properties say that they refuse to take vouchers. They refuse to take government income as a source of income, and they use that as a reason to turn people down. We don't accept Section 8 vouchers. We don't accept housing vouchers. We don't accept some of the VA vouchers. I think there's a significant body of evidence that suggests that that's pretextual. The notion of we don't take vouchers, you'll take somebody's pay stub when they could be sacked tomorrow as evidence of their ability to pay. Somebody having a voucher is a much more likely long-term reliable source of income than anybody's pay stub would be. What we've seen around the country, including in Virginia, is Commonwealth and states adding to the fair housing laws and prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of source of income. I introduced a bill first with Senator Orrin Hatch to do this. Utah was one of the early states in the country that prohibited discrimination on the source of income, and we haven't yet been able to get that passed. I have helped and encouraged Virginia to pass it at the Commonwealth level, and I think it's working. But I have a bill at the federal level, and I guess I'd like to ask Ms. Bailey, how would you see something like the Fair Housing Improvements Act making it easier for people to afford housing when they have a source of income that would enable them to pay the rent?
No, thanks, Senator, and thanks for the work on this really important issue, because we also know that source of income discrimination can also be a proxy for racial discrimination, right, and discrimination for people with disabilities, because we know the voucher program serves all people, and particularly people with disabilities and people of color. So this is critically important, and it can make a difference. What's also, having a law is important. Also, putting the resources behind enforcement of the law is a critical component of any source of income anti-discrimination measures, because we have to make sure that landlords know that there will be action taken if they discriminate against voucher holders, because we just need everyone to be able to have a safe place to call home.
Great, thank you. Last thing I'll say and then hand it back, Mr. Chair, is I'm a big fan of the LIHTC program. Just watching how the Virginia Housing, used to be the Virginia Housing Development Authority, uses those federal dollars to incentivize the construction of low and moderate income rental property, and putting requirements in that means significant percentages of those receiving the LIHTC funding have to be accessible units for seniors, for folks with disabilities. Much of the accessible housing stock in Virginia has been produced through smart use of LIHTC. And so I'm a strong believer that you don't have to create a new program when you have one that's working. You just need to do more of it. And I think LIHTC is one of those. With that, thanks to the witnesses, I hand it back.
And thank you to Senator Kaine for his.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Houthi behavior is abhorrent, but I've got to admit, I have grave skepticism about what we are doing right now. I have grave skepticism about the legal authorities. I have grave skepticism about the absence of true shared responsibility with nations whose ships are being attacked by the Houthis. Why should the U.S. and the U.K. be shouldering the burden of protecting other nations' ships? And I have serious skepticism about the effectiveness of this operation in terms of de-escalating either the attacks in the Red Sea. To begin with, on legal authority, I think we've all conceded that there is no congressional authorization for these hostilities. The hostilities definition under the War Powers Resolution has clearly been met when we're talking about 200 attacks on Houthis. We're losing troops, they're losing civilian casualties and others. This is hostilities. There's no congressional authorization for them. To claim that this is covered by Article 2 self-defense, Article 2 self-defense means you can defend U.S. personnel, you can defend U.S. military assets, you probably can defend U.S. commercial ships. But the defense of other nations' commercial ships in no way, and it's not even close, that's not self-defense under Article 2 of the Constitution. And a president can't make it self-defense by calling another nation a partner. If you're defending the commercial ships of other nations, it is, in my view, laughable to call that self-defense. And so a narrow mission to defend U.S. shipping, both military and commercial, that is Article 2 self-defense. But broader efforts to defend commercial ships of other nations, while it might be strategically a good idea, there's no constitutional authorization that would allow a president to do that unilateral. And second, taking offensive actions and striking targets within Yemen to degrade Yemeni capacity, Houthi capacity, while again it might be strategically a smart thing to do, that's not self-defense under Article 2. And so I basically view this at the first level as a set of actions that might have a strategic value, although we've yet to see a strategy. Senator Young and Senator Murphy and I wrote a letter to the administration asking many of these questions on January 23rd, and we don't have a response. But there may be a strategic wisdom in doing it, but I think the activities are far beyond what a president's unilateral power would be. That's number one. Number two, shared responsibility. Commercial shipping in the Red Sea involves ships from many, many nations. And although there are partners in this operation, the military actions are being undertaken by the United States and the UK. Why should the United States and UK be shouldering the burden of this? There needs to be, if we can get to a point where we can actually authorize U.S. participation, we shouldn't do it without other nations participating. But finally, I guess my most serious skepticism right now is at the effectiveness of this. President Biden himself has said that the actions that we are undertaking are not likely to deter Houthi escalation. And I am a little disappointed that you so quickly try to pull cold water on the idea that this is connected to the war in Gaza. These attacks started, Secretary Shapiro, as you said, on November 19. The Houthis have said this is because of the war in Gaza. Now, you've pointed out instances of ships that weren't going to Israel or instances of ships that had food that were going to nations that needed food. But I think the most natural interpretation of this is the Houthis seeing some suffer in the region or saying others are going to suffer in the region until we figure out a response. And I would venture to suggest that about the only time we've seen something that was a de-escalation moment was in the week-plus-long pause in Gaza when the first hostage deal was done. And so trying to reestablish deterrence, I don't think you're going to do it if the 200 strikes become 400 strikes, 800 strikes, 1,200 strikes. I think you will reestablish deterrence when we get a hostage deal that leads us to a truce, that leads us to humanitarian aid into Gaza, that leads us to the ability to discuss whether whatever that truce period is can be extended. And so I hope you don't just pour cold water on the idea that, oh, this isn't really related to Gaza, because the timing of it was related to Gaza. They're saying it's related to Gaza, and the only period of de-escalation that we've seen was during the first hostage release. I'm going to continue to press on the legal authority questions, and I think many of us have these questions, and there's some difference of opinion, I think, on the committee about whether this U.S. strategy is going to involve de-escalation at all, or whether it's actually going to foment more regional conflict. I consider myself in the camp of senators who believe the U.S. involvement in another war in the Middle East would reflect that we learned virtually nothing over the last 25 years. And we definitely shouldn't slip or slide into a war. This is the kind of thing that can lead us to slip or slide into a war, and that's why Congress needs to be engaged and have a debate about whether this is a mission that's in the national interest or not. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Romney.
Hearing. I want to ask a question about the way to support diverse healthcare providers in innovative models that we are kind of rolling out, value-based models. Let me talk about a primary care physician who practices in Richmond named Lurla Joseph. I've known Dr. Joseph since I was on city council and mayor. She's an African-American woman. She serves predominantly African-American community in Richmond, Virginia. Her patients are more likely to be uninsured or underinsured, and they're more likely to have multiple chronic conditions that require significantly complex management. When the ACA was passed, Dr. Joseph saw the growth of value-based care movement as an opportunity to look for new ways to provide care for her patients. And since then, she has successfully participated in accountable care models, resulting both in cost savings but also improved patient outcomes. But as part of this journey, she's realized that we, as Congress, but also the CMMI, could be doing more to support diverse providers, rural providers, small providers. As she says, equality is one thing, but equity is another. She believes a lot of the focus on building these value-based care models have focused on larger providers and not necessarily those serving rural or minority communities. Not every provider is starting from the same starting point. Some need more support than others to make the transition of value-based care. And it seems obvious to me that we could do more to support diverse providers, and we should. So perhaps I'll just start with you, Dr. Navathe. What more can Congress and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation do to support diverse providers serving their communities when it comes to these value-based care innovations?
Thank you, Senator, for this very important question. So I think just taking one quick step into the root cause might help understand. So when CMMI typically tests a model, it tests in a voluntary framework where providers have to raise their hand and say, I want to join. Perhaps it's not surprising then that well-resourced providers who can bear risk and can make investments end up joining. And so we don't get a representative population. We then look at the results and the practice innovations for those models, and we try to scale them. And that doesn't always work for diverse populations. So I think as we think about what CMMI and others can do to help, kind of boils down to maybe three things. One, we need models that are really truly directed towards safety net providers, toward rural providers, toward providers that take care of diverse populations. So there's increased investment and technical support for them. Secondly, when we do voluntary models, we have to check for representativeness. We have to make sure that we're actually getting participation from those or create better incentives for that to happen. And third, rethink this paradigm of voluntary to mandatory. This idea that we're just going to let whoever raises their hand and then scale what happens. We might have to rethink that to begin with.
Can I, and Mr. Chairman, I get on a soapbox here that I wasn't intending to get on, but based on Dr. Navathe's answer, this equality versus equity thing. Some people seem to be really worried about the word equity. And yet you've just given a perfect example. Participation in a program, first come, first serve, raise your hand. That is as equal as can be. But it's not going to produce the right health outcome. It's not. When we started to finally deploy vaccines that were developed in COVID, we said anybody over 65 can get them. That's as equal as can be. But what we found after about 3 months of that was some people over 65 really know how to use a computer, and in my neighborhood they were searching, Walgreens has it today, but next, and then it's the CVS across town. Those who had the computer and the time to use it, they were getting vaccines. And those who didn't have the computer or didn't have the time to use it or had a day job even they were over 65 and didn't have the time to spend, they were not getting vaccinated. And then 90 days into the vaccination rollout, the communities that were getting hit hardest with COVID were being under-vaccinated compared to others. Now, everyone is eligible if you're age 65. That is an equality policy. There's nothing unequal about that. But it was producing an inequitable result that was actually hurting the health outcomes of the people who were most affected by COVID. So we actually learned as we're then in the deployment of vaccines, and we switched to models where we're going to do vaccine clinics in public housing communities. We're going to do vaccine clinics in rural places where folks might not have the CVS so close to them as somebody else does. And then over time, the vaccination rate started to sort of more equalize among the population. But to do that, we had to be intentional about it. And I In the health space, I can think of about 50 examples of this where the policy that is an equality policy is not going to produce an equitable result, but maybe more importantly, it's not going to produce the result that's right in terms of the health outcomes that we're seeking. And so I really appreciate you sharing that answer, and Mr. Chair, I'll yield back to you.
Senator Kaine, followed by Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Young, good to be with you. Budgets aren't about numbers, they're about people. The U.S. economy has come out of COVID stronger than any economy in the world, large economy. Jobs are up, unemployment's down, manufacturing jobs are up, inflation is coming down, people's 401ks are up, the rate of people who have insurance in this country dramatically up. These are the measures that I look at when I look at a budget and an economy. And I don't see a competing economy in the world that has done what the U.S. has done, and we've exceeded our own expectations from the CBO and others, as Senator Van Hollen stated. A couple of comments on some Virginia priorities, then I want to dig into child care with you. First, I really appreciate the President's budget has funding to save Tangier Island in the Chesapeake Bay. I asked you a question for the record in your confirmation hearing about the President's willingness to invest in fighting sea level rise and promoting coastal resilience, and the President's budget includes funding that builds on CDS funding I've received in the past to make sure we save this island in the Chesapeake Bay that has lost about 70% of its land mass and is extremely vulnerable to climate change. I was not happy that the President's budget zeroed out a program that I care a lot about, the Lorna Breen Act, which is funding for the health care needs of the mental health needs of our health care providers. The budget is strong with respect to behavioral health. I think that's great. But there's a particular program that I've worked on bipartisan that focuses upon the mental health needs of health care providers, named after a Virginia emergency room physician who died by suicide in April of 2020. And I'll work with my colleagues to make sure we continue that funding. I know you're under some tight budget caps that affected some of the priorities that I care about. Let me ask you about one right now. The President sent us a supplemental that we have passed in the Senate by a 70 to 29 vote for national security. And one of the items in the supplemental was a significant investment in an initiative of President Biden's I strongly support, the AUKUS framework. We'll work together with Australia and the UK to build out more deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. And pillar one of that framework is construction of Virginia-class submarines and selling them to Australia in the 2030s, eventually equipping Australia with the capacity to build their own subs in the 2040. So the President strongly supports it, and he should. It's a great initiative. But the President's budget that was sent up to us actually reduces funding for Virginia-class subs. We've been budgeting at 2 a year. The President has suggested in this budget that we would only build 1 a year. To get to our commitment level where we can meet what we've committed to with Australia, we have to get to 2.3 a year. So I view the 2 to 1 in this budget as an unfortunate backslide that is sort of in a cognitive dissonance with the President's request that we fund the AUKUS initiative. Can you tell us about some of the challenging trade-offs that you've had to make in putting this budget together to meet budget caps?
Look, we felt it was important. When the President makes a deal, he keeps a deal, to stick by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. But I want you to know the President, the administration, fully believe in the AUKUS partnership with Australia. We fund about the equivalent of 1.3 submarines a year. We need that number to go to something like 2.3. So it is not just funding the submarines. We have got to invest in our submarine industrial base. So one thing I'd ask you to do is look at this in concert with the supplemental. We need that supplemental to move out of the House, not just for our partners in Ukraine and Israel and humanitarian assistance, but we don't talk about the submarine and Indo-Pacific part enough. And that money is critical to not just building submarines, but building the base so we can actually, when we ask for 2, we can get 2. Because right now, the industrial base is not sufficient and does not have enough capacity to do that. So we really need that supplemental to move in order to keep our agreement intact with AUKUS, and we look forward to working with you and others to make sure that AUKUS remains in place, that we get the submarine money, and the industrial base fit to produce more submarines.
Thank you. Other colleagues have praised the president's budget in the child care area, and I join that. So good for parents, so good for kids, so good for child care workers, great for the economy. It will free up more people to come back in who are out of the economy now. Last question is, how challenging is it for you to be 6 months into a fiscal year and not have appropriations bills done?
Oh, the old staff director in me is on the back seat in trouble. I now regret the late bills I may have worked on and did not fully appreciate how difficult it is to implement programs, the efficiency. Just think about last Friday. Big fire drill, 4 o'clock, we're like, uh-oh, is the Senate gonna pass this in time? Activating lots of people, seeing if we have to put stuff on hold. It is no way to run a government. And so we share your frustration. We want to look for ways. Speaking of bipartisanship and things we have to work together on, one is on the process questions. I'm one of those believers that process makes a good output, gives us a good product. And we have to do something and work on the process of the appropriations process. And my guess is it's something I'll think about and work on for the rest of my time working in this town, because it's incredibly important, and agencies depend on this. And by the way, I like the annual process. I don't want to see the frustration with that process do away with that. I think it's a good thing that Congress looks at, now it's 30% of programs every year. But unless we fix the process, that frustration is going to bubble up and endanger, because you see the problems with it, the threats of shutdown.
You have many supporters on that point in the committee, including the chairman. I appreciate your service. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank both of you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Kaine, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for your great service. General Guillot, I want to begin with you. My colleagues and I on this committee have recently discussed installation security with respect to drone threats at bases in the United States. Recognizing that we're in an unclassified setting, what can you tell me about how NORTHCOM is addressing this issue, and with what partners are you working this challenge?
Senator, NORTHCOM, as part of my 90-day assessment, to tell the truth, the counter-UAS mission has dominated that so far in the first month. Of course, I knew it was an issue coming from another combatant command where we faced that threat in a very different way because of the environment, but I wasn't prepared for the number of incursions that I see. Gone into the events at Joint Base Langley-Eustis, and I'm using that as the centerpiece of my 90-day assessment to see where NORAD and NORTHCOM can and should do more as this emerging capability outstrips the operational framework that we have to address it.
And can you talk about other partners that you're working
Yes.
with? Because obviously there's sort of a law enforcement component of this. So who else is working with you on this problem set?
Yes, sir, absolutely. So primarily Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice along the border have the primary responsibility. That's who I'm working with there. In the interior, it's the services that have the responsibility for defending their bases. So working with each individual service, and then also, again, Department of Homeland Security and Department of Energy for specific critical infrastructure locations. Those are the primary ones that I'm working with.
Thank you for that. Now a question for both of you about FMS. The importance of FMS was mentioned by General Kurilla last week. General Guillot, you mentioned it in your written statement. General Richardson, you and I talked about it a little bit last week when we were together. The FMS programs not only increase interoperability and strengthen partnerships, but can help reduce our partners' reliance upon strategic competitors as well. What are you hearing from your counterparts about FMS? And I want to particularly direct at the General Richardson, recognizing General Guillot's short tenure that's been dominated by other issues. But General Richardson, could you talk about this?
So FMS is a critical enabler, and obviously with being able to have our equipment have up-to-date equipment, and then having U.S. equipment and being interoperable and that sort of thing is an imperative. And so what Secretary Austin and the chairman have instituted to speed up the processes within FMS over the past 2 years have taken place. But I would say that we've got to streamline that through the interagency, because it's not just the Department of Defense that has a stake in that and that approves things. And so we've got to streamline that process a little bit better and speed it up.
We talked last week in my office about the potential synergy between the state partnership program that Senator Peters was discussing and the theater maintenance partnership initiative. Could you talk a little bit about that and whether it could support or complement the FMS priorities that we have?
Well, it absolutely. I mean, that's the whole reason for it, where we have U.S. equipment in these countries, and so maintenance is hard for our U.S. military, and it's hard for our partner nations as well. And so, with turnover, we always in our U.S. military have people coming in and going out and leaving the military, and so there's a constant turnover. So you have to have a really good teaching and training program at the tactical level, and so. The TMPI program, the Theater Maintenance Partnership Initiative that you mentioned, the nexus with the National Guard State Partnership Program, there's tons of maintainers in the National Guard. And so this makes a very simple, easy way to teach and train, fits right in line with the institutional capacity building as well.
Last question I'd like to ask you, General Richardson. One of the best advantages we have in your region is the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. You have made this a real priority in your travel. Can you speak on the impacts that the WPS initiatives are having within our partner countries?
Huge impact. So thank you for the question, Senator. UN Security Council Resolution 1325 for women, peace, and security. And so in every visit I do in the countries, we have a women, peace, and security event. The great thing is that we get what I call a twofer with our enlisted leader professional development program as well. We have many women enlisted leaders that are in our military formations in the region, and so that dovetailing nicely with our different programs. They're both rock star programs, if I must say. And our partner nations doing that and seeing the diversity and the ability to increase readiness within their forces, they have realized that, and they continue on a really good path.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Administrator Power. Good to see you. I want to stick with the discussion about Gaza. Mr. Chair, I'd like to enter into a record, an article from The Hill that was from Sunday, titled, Cindy McCain says Gaza on the edge of going over the cliff with famine and not being able to recover. Cindy is the widow of our former Senate Foreign Relations colleague, John McCain, a dear friend. I know, Administrator Power, you work closely.
Without objection, it'll be included in the record.
Thank you. I know you work closely with the World Food Program, and you know Cindy McCain. Do you share that concern that she expressed just 3 days ago, that Gazans are on the verge of very serious risk of famine?
Yes, I mean, I think the report that was done, which drew on really the gold standard of how we measure these things, is very clear on this matter. And WHO is already reporting deaths related to conditions stemming from malnutrition. And to just put this in some context, because it's clear that the humanitarian circumstances weren't great in Gaza before October 7th. But before October 7th, there was almost no child malnutrition whatsoever. And now close to 1 in 3 in northern Gaza. And if you look at, the severe acute malnutrition where you measure with the circumference, access is very difficult for organizations that measure these things. But just from January to February, not taking account of the last 6 weeks, severe acute malnutrition doubled among under 5 kids. So we are, and Cindy, of course, our USAID's great collaborator, and her teams were very eager to get food in there, but also very specifically to address the under 5 needs, which require ready-to-use therapeutic food, so very specific kind of assistance, and we're hopeful that some of the changes that have been made and are being contemplated but need to be made urgently by Israel will allow us to flow in resources to nip what is a famine fundamentally in the bud.
I asked Secretary Austin yesterday at an Armed Services Committee hearing whether growing famine or medical catastrophe in Gaza would escalate violence in the region, and he said absolutely it would. The activities of Hezbollah in the north, the activities of the Houthis in the Red Sea, the activities of Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, possibly activities of Iran itself, will only escalate at a time when we need to be looking for de-escalation, a hostage deal, a ceasefire, de-escalation in the region. So we have a compelling interest, we, the United States, the world, Israel, Gaza, Palestine, to avert this widening humanitarian catastrophe. Israel, of course, must defend itself against any who would annihilate it, including Hamas, Hamas who carried out the attack, who celebrated it, who says they'll do it again. But this should not be a war against Gazans or Palestinians. It should be a war against Hamas. And one of the main bits of evidence about what is it is the access to humanitarian supplies, especially food and medicine. We were getting about 500 trucks a day of supplies into Gaza before October 7. It was in the single digits or dozens for months and months and months. It took too long to open the Kerem-Shalom border crossing. I do applaud President Biden in his conversations last week with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Subsequently, Kerem-Shalom has been opened wider in terms of more supplies in. There's been a commitment to open the Erez border crossing. And we see the pace picking up. Israel has restored water service into the north of Gaza. Israel has allowed bakeries to open again to provide, make bread and food for Gazans. The pace of the trucks per day exceeded 300 for the first time on Sunday and got near 500 on Monday. But it has taken way too long to get supplies to suffering Gazans. Gazans are suffering under Hamas. They're not all Hamas. And so I would just like to ask you, I know as USAID, you work with these NGOs, many of which were troubled, frightened, scared, backed off of their activities after the attack on the World Central Kitchen convoy. Talk to me about what USAID can do in your remit to provide more confidence that humanitarian aid can be delivered at scale.
The poster board.
That's the next person.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just.
You got to get through Senator
He makes
Kaine
an
first.
entrance. Look, what I would say is that I traveled to the region last month, and the nature of my engagement kind of mirrors the way you've played back some of the progress that's been made lately, which is, saying to the IDF and to the Prime Minister and to the government, these things are going to be done. The situation is going to get so bad that these additional steps are going to be taken. Just take them now, hard as it is, and understanding the domestic politics and public opinion after what Hamas did. And unfortunately, a lot of time has been lost. And the commitments are really welcome, but the commitments need to be executed, including an additional crossing into the north, not just the agreement to do it, but the actual crossing. And you're right that the number of trucks is up, and that's incredibly important. But I think we also need to give some context here, which is you're also right that 500 trucks were entering before October 7th, but that was commercial, that was humanitarian. It wasn't as if every family was in need of humanitarian assistance. Now, every family, pretty much, I think, is in need of humanitarian assistance. And if you think of the destruction of anything that one had in their home, markets, granaries, arable land, the bulldozing of arable land, and what you described, which is how few trucks were getting in over such a long period of time, we just have so much catch-up to do. Apart from the fact that whole towns where people lived, no longer exist in the way that they did, where more than half of the buildings have been destroyed or damaged or uninhabitable in some fashion. So this is just unlike any of the environments that I've worked in the past or our partners have worked in, where there's some kind of reliable place where people can either start to rebuild their lives or imagine that the war ends and they can return to the lives they had and begin to grow their land again. I mean, all of that is going to take so long. So it just underscores, again, the importance of passing the National Security Supplemental Request so we have the resources to help, but understanding that the access issues and the protection issues where humanitarians can actually do their work safely, that those are commitments that have been made are followed through on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yesterday.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Chair.
Senator,
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses today for your service. General Hawk, I want to start with you. Your predecessor, General Nakasone, was very vocal about the need for FISA reauthorization. And you've also talked about Section 702 and the role it has played, for example, in identifying fentanyl supplies from China. Often FISA discussions, when we have them here, we have them in a classified setting, and that doesn't educate the public about how FISA is helpful, recognizing that we are unclassified. Can you talk about examples like identifying fentanyl supply chains and others where FISA 702 is extremely helpful?
Senator, thank you for the question. Section 702 is vital and it's indispensable. It is an authority that has been granted by Congress that allows us to collect on foreign intelligence targets outside of the United States. And so the example that we talk about from a fentanyl perspective is our ability to use that authority when a communication is transiting a U.S. Service provider that allows us to be very focused on that foreign intelligence target to bring back information. In this case, it allows us to connect dots from the precursors as they start in China and all the way through to the potential criminal organization within Mexico in this case, whereas most of that reporting. We have produced significant amounts of reporting that allow law enforcement to now look at that from a targeted perspective, leveraging the data we've created in foreign intelligence outside the United States to be able to then take action to limit risk to the American people.
General Hawk, I appreciate that answer. I'm glad we could have that in an open discussion. General Fenton, you closed your opening testimony very strong, and one of my colleagues said it was promoting joining the ranks, and I think that was the phrase you learned. We want people to join the ranks. It was superb. I've been running in recently as I travel across the Commonwealth with a phenomenon that troubles me a bit, and I've been raising it with key military leaders, and that's the phenomenon of a young person who really wants to join the military. And it might be special forces, it might be, any of the branches of the military. And they go far through the process and they're qualified, but then they get turned down toward the end of the process over a health issue that seems minor, childhood asthma or a history of allergies. Senator Cotton raised this point yesterday. I think Senator Mullen raised it as well. And my experience in talking to some of these folks is when they get turned down, it's just like a no with no real explanation and also no encouragement. Because when you say, when you say we need people to join the ranks of our military are uniformed service personnel and DOD civilians and Guard and reservists and our contracting community that provide the supplies and equipment that our military members need. If somebody gets turned down on a health issue that disqualifies them from serving in a particular service branch, but they want to serve the country, there's still ways for them to serve the country as a civilian or as a part of the one of our contractors. I have shipyards in Virginia that are desperate for workers. We've made a commitment to sell subs to the Australians in the 2030s. How are we going to meet our own needs, much less theirs? But what I find from a manpower standpoint is while we want to attract the best and the brightest, we often are turning people away who desperately want to serve the country without giving them the other paths where they can serve. This is not a critique of you. I'm just going off the closing argument that you made that was so powerful, that we want people to join the ranks. I sometimes think we don't necessarily send that message. That the ranks include the broader ecosystem of those who serve and also those who support those who serve. And I'm just hoping that all of you might take that to heart as you're contemplating carrying out the important missions we entrust to you.
Senator, happy to comment. First, thank you for that. And I think it gets to the heart of why that was in our statement. It really is about service writ large. While in particular I can speak to service in the military, but you've laid it out. I also work alongside our incredible civilian teammates in the Department of Defense, incredible teammates across the whole of the interagency of the U.S. government, from intel agencies and great teammates in Commerce and Treasury, all fantastic, and I imagine having a very valuable journey in their own particular way. I think as well, we're out very often as Special Operations Command in the communities, seeing mayors, seeing school board teammates, seeing folks who volunteer even for various clubs, and all to make the nation better. So it really is a call to all of that and more, Senator, and I appreciate you noting it. And we absolutely, I align myself with the way you laid it out. And we love to see more folks who would give us an opportunity to have their talents and skills, because it goes to the heart of really what we believe in SOCOM. People are number one. It's all about the people.
Thank you, General. I appreciate that. And I have one more question for you, Secretary Mayor. During the posture hearings last year, you submitted written testimony talking about accelerating SOCOM's wide-ranging modernization efforts. Could you briefly describe how you are doing in the modernization side?
Yeah, Senator, so I think we're doing well. We have distinct advantages in the special operations enterprise, in particular at SOCOM, with an acquisition executive that sits there and is integrated with the operators. So we're able to modernize at a kind of local level. I think, as already addressed in the previous question about budget, that ends up becoming a pacing function. It's increasingly more expensive to do higher-end combat, higher-end preparation. So we're looking for where we can do more affordable modernization, and really in many cases building on what is already in the inventory and making it better. We call it soft peculiar. We rely on the services for the base and then modernize on top of it for the soft specific missions, sir. So I think we're moving in a good direction. Everybody wishes it went faster. The adversaries are going to require that we move faster, so we remain very focused on that, sir.
Thank you, Senator Kaine. Senator Round.
Committee on Western Hemisphere, Transnational Crime, Civilian Security, Democracy, Human Rights, and Global Women's Issues will come to order. It's a pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses. Today's hearing focuses on the U.S. strategy to counter transnational criminal networks and corruption in the Western Hemisphere. As always, I want to thank Ranking Member Senator Rubio and his team for their excellent partnership and for their help framing up this hearing. The work that we've done on the region together is something I'm very proud of. The U.S. and our 34 neighbors in the region, in this hemisphere, share deep ties, close history, family connections. Crime and corruption pose a growing and present threat to our friends across the hemisphere and to the safety and security of Americans right here at home. Transnational criminal organizations, TCOs, use corruption, intimidation, violence as tools to influence government officials and create a more favorable environment for illicit activities. We've seen time and again that this type of insidious erosion of public trust in government and democratic institutions has led to political instability and a surge in migration flows toward America's southern border. It also creates avenues for encroachment by foreign adversaries like the PRC and Russia that brazenly exploit these weaknesses. In December 2021, the White House released a U.S. strategy on countering corruption, which establishes 5 pillars. First, modernizing, coordinating, and resourcing U.S. government efforts to fight corruption. Second, curbing illicit finance. Third, holding corrupt actors accountable. Fourth, preserving the strength of multilateral anti-corruption networks. And finally, improving diplomatic engagement. The administration's national security strategy, released in October 2022, pledges to accelerate global U.S. government efforts against TCOs and integrate law enforcement efforts with diplomatic, financial intelligence, and other tools in coordination with our foreign allies and partners. These are ambitious goals. Today we're going to talk about how we're doing, how they're being implemented, and what more we need to do together. It's not an abstract issue. Transparency International's 2023 Corruption Perceptions Index highlights citizens' perceptions of public sector corruption around the world in several Western Hemisphere countries. The scores for 10 countries in the region ranked among the bottom third of the 180 countries included in the index. Among the worst performing countries in the region are Venezuela and Nicaragua, where corruption is entrenched in autocratic regimes, Haiti, where violent gangs threaten to overthrow the government, and Mexico, where the cartels have expanded their reach and influence. U.S. assistance and engagement are critical to countering these threats to our national security. We have an essential role to play in bolstering the stability of the region in the face of these challenges. Every crisis faced by the region and its people deeply and directly impacts the U.S. The U.S. can't stand on the sidelines. It's essential that we work in partnership with our neighbors to strengthen democratic institutions and the rule of law. We owe it to those partners and allies and to our friends and family in the region and here at home to take the initiative and bring the fight directly to pernicious actors who are creating these threats. Now let me turn it over to Ranking Member Senator Rubio for his remarks before I introduce the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's good to see both of you. Secretary Granholm, I always enjoy our opportunities to do events in Virginia together. We've had some good ones. I want to ask about a topic that you raised in your joint written testimony, and that is trying to develop strategies to counter uncrewed aerial systems. We've had testimony in this hearing, public testimony from General Guillot of Northcom about the drone swarms around Langley, which are troubling. Those have been publicly reported and discussed in open session, but I noticed in your joint written testimony that you talked about NNSA trying to kind of up its game in developing counter-UAS strategies. Can you talk to the committee a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. This has been an issue at some of our sites. We have identified the UASs near areas where that are sensitive. Here's what we have UAS detection systems deployed at all of our sites. They have some limited capability to counter those systems. We're updating the current systems, and we're evaluating a new system that has much more counter capability. We're testing that. We're establishing a test site at Idaho so that we can keep up with the threat. My intention, and I've been very clear about this with the complex, is as soon as a UAS crosses the line that we have declared as this is dangerous, we need to counter it. We can't just say we see it, we have to counter it. And we're positioning ourselves in this budget request and in the work that we're doing to make sure we can do that.
Can I ask you, as we are trying to grapple with this threat, I've sometimes not been satisfied as I've asked questions about sort of who's in charge of this. I mean, on domestic soil, the FBI is involved and DHS is involved, but then DOD is involved. You have to work with, you know, the cities and towns and counties where facilities are located. Is the NNSA sort of at a table of stakeholders with others trying to figure this out from a whole of government standpoint?
Yes, we do work closely, especially with the FBI. I will say that we benefit from having large remote sites. Yeah. Again, we've clearly delineated where the lines are in terms of our sensitivities. And so we are working towards policies that allow us to take action without needing to get we need that policy approved by everybody, but once we have the policy approved, we can take action without getting additional approvals. That's the end goal that we're looking for.
Thank you. Switching gears, this committee and the Foreign Relations Committee have been pretty involved in putting into law the AUKUS framework, both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Talk to me about NNSA's involvement in working with the Australians on the Pillar 1, equipping them with the capacity to operate and maintain and eventually to construct nuclear subs.
Well, we have two activities in NNSA on Pillar 1. There's the activities that we do in naval reactors, and there's the activities we do in nonproliferation. In the naval reactors program, we have Australian sailors now taking nuclear reactor training. That's for us, for our role, that's the most important thing, is to make sure that the Australian Navy has the capability and the complete thorough training that we enjoy in the U.S. to operate these boats effectively. On the nonproliferation side, our goal is to have this be a model program for nonproliferation. We have lots of work with the Australians to help them understand what that is, and to work with the IAEA to create systems to make sure that there could be absolutely no diversion. We're going to deliver sealed nuclear reactors that power these boats, but still, we will need to make sure there's no material diversion, no potential for any material being stolen in any way. And we feel very confident that the Australians are taking this seriously and are working very closely with us.
Excellent. Well, I don't want to exceed my time after having been warned by the chair that we're going to try to move quickly, but Secretary Granholm, I'm going to ask you a question for the record. Last year, you talked about some initiatives the Department of Energy is doing to find talent at HBCUs and minority-serving institutions and partnership you're creating. I'll ask for the record, and we'll look forward to seeing what is the progress on that front. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Kaine.
Rep. Perriello, it's really good to see you. Very good to see you. Along with others on this committee, I began advocating for the creation of this special envoy position quite a while ago, because the magnitude of this challenge, including the fact that the world isn't paying sufficient attention to it, demonstrated that we really needed to up our game and devote more resources to being a part of the solution. I was so happy when finally the administration decided to create this position, and the fact that you, a longtime friend with deep background in the region and an expertise to be able to do this work with distinction, were nominated for it and put into the role is something I'm very gratified by. And I know I speak for many of my colleagues, and certainly Senator Warner, who also advocated for the creation of this position. I've got a couple of questions for you. The questions my colleagues have asked, I think, have done a good job of framing out the challenge. I want to make sure you have the resources to do the job that you need to do. But before I get there, just an observation. As you know, Virginia has a pretty significant diaspora community from Sudan. And we have a diaspora community from a number of African nations, because 1 out of 8 of us now is born in another country. One of the things I've noticed in the past in interacting with diaspora communities, and I'll use Ethiopia as an example, our diaspora here have different points of view. Some are sympathetic to the central government, some are more sympathetic to the Tigray region's leaders. So it's not uncommon within a diaspora community to find divided opinions. Within the Sudanese diaspora in Virginia, I've not found divided opinions. I've found among the Sudanese, as you point out, there was a belief that they had negotiated a path forward and that they believe both the ASF and the RSF are hijacking that path. And it's interesting to walk into a meeting of a diaspora community and not have an internal tension about who they support. They would very much support a process as you describe, and it's a very difficult thing, but it's nice to know that at least here at the home front, the diaspora community here with deep ties in Sudan are really on board with the vision that you and the administration have outlined. It's said here in D.C. that personnel make policy, and we pressed hard for this envoy position. Glad to learn, as I said, that you were Secretary Blinken's candidate, and I think you're the right one. Do you have what you need, both in terms of personnel and resources, to fulfill this very challenging mandate? And could you describe the makeup of the team that you're working with?
Thanks, Senator. And I do feel like I have had tremendous support from the State Department and the interagency all the way up to the Secretary. And I want to come back to that. But on your diaspora point, I think it's really important to underline what you've said. Because I think we see the same thing with Sudanese civilians across the region, many of whom are spread across Nairobi, Kampala, Chad, et cetera. This won't surprise any of you, but if you just look at Twitter and Facebook, you would think that people are very divided on certain political questions. But in fact, when you actually talk to people, and the polls show this as well, there is incredible consensus among the Sudanese people about wanting an end to the war and wanting a restoration of the arc that they had finally had that was hopeful. And I think even on some of the additional questions about things like not wanting to see the backdoor to power from former corrupt officials or Islamic extremists, Again, they're very interesting and important questions that will take years for the Sudanese to decide and to debate, much like we have many in our own country. And that's the right thing to happen in a democracy that they hope to have. So there are questions that are quite vibrant discussions, but there's not disagreement on this core question about ending the war, returning to a civilian transition, and having an integrated professional military under SAF, bringing in not just the RSF, but the various JPA signatories into that process. They want to be proud of their military like we are, and they want the reforms and things that will get there. Some of those things will take years to happen, just like it took years to set up the Joint Command here. But again, I think we've seen that in the diaspora, and I want to give a particular acknowledgement, which again won't surprise you from your work, that this consensus has been particularly strong and particularly powerful among Sudanese women. We've seen this through various alliances around the region and inside. It's been such an important part of the resistance committees that helped bring Bashir down and that have helped to shield communities from harm during these atrocious circumstances. I've seen it in my organizing meetings around the region. Not only the group that is most likely to show up on time with an agenda and action steps ready is definitely going to be the alliances. We had a wonderful event here with Vital Voices that Linda Thomas Greenfield joined that had a number of very powerful Sudanese women speaking out on this experience. And of course, this is in no small part because women and girls have borne the brunt of many of the atrocities, certainly the horrific and systematic use of rape as a weapon of war, but also the issues of famine and starvation and displacement. So we do believe the diaspora in this case has a very important and constructive role to play. It also goes back to Senator Young's point and others about needing that to be a community that wants to return to Sudan, whether full-time or being investing there, whether that's investing their human capital or their other capital. And I think people do stand ready to build that future Sudan in this case. So I'm proud of how many we have in Virginia of people from Sudan, but also it is something where we've got a broader voice here that needs to be amplified and that we can try to center in these conversations. And I think that's an important message I've had to both our Saudi hosts and others about the talks, which is the baseline for the negotiations need to be what the Sudanese people have already stated as the framework.
I want the chairman to be able to ask questions. Can you just give me a very quick answer on, do you have the resources you need to fulfill your mandate?
We do. I mean, we have, posts have been incredible. As you know, I'm traveling almost every day, and that's a lot of work for an underfunded department. People have been wonderful. I think that there's some mid to over the horizon questions we can talk about, whether it's Special Envoy's office or Sudan more generally, of what we should be ready for in a case of further deterioration or a breakthrough. But I've been very appreciative of the welcome at State and the Secretary's willingness to engage directly on this issue at the highest levels with some of the key actors.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Sullivan. And I'll follow up with you, General Mingus, on the future soldier, because I'm intrigued with that. You say about 18,000 folks have come through. I spent some time down at Fort Eustis talking about this and was really impressed maybe 18 months ago. 90% are able to get to the standard by the end of that course. It hasn't been in place that long, but what are you finding? I hope we're going to longitudinally follow this group to see what we learn about retention. Did it not only enable them to meet the standard, but maybe prepare them to, hey, I really want to stick with this? And probably a little bit too early to draw conclusions about that. Am I right about that?
You are, sir, and we are absolutely going to track everyone from a longitudinal perspective, just to make sure we haven't created another problem. So far, the data suggests that it's not. First term is on par with other first-termers, and so as a result, we're considering the expansion of, instead of just doing it in South Carolina, maybe expanding it to other basic training locations.
Well, it'll be interesting over time to compare folks who went through Future Soldier with those who didn't, and see if there's a different, kind of stickiness to their desire to stay. So I'll look forward to following that. And I know that many of the other services are watching carefully what you're doing, and Navy and others are implementing too. So thanks for that. Here's an issue that I've raised with a number of you when we've talked in the past. I'm really worried about the inadequacy of the labor supply in our industrial base. So, you know, the 45-day shipbuilding analysis that was done, Admiral Kilby, you and I talked about this work done by the SecNav directed to look at why are we so late on the Columbia, why are we so late on Ford class, Virginia class, and there's a number of reasons, but the workforce is a key one. And even when it's workforce plus supply chain, often the challenge on the supply chain is the workforce. So we see this really spread throughout, and I'm really nervous about it. Here's what I'm finding, though, that troubles me. Every year, military recruiters turn away thousands of young Americans who are disqualified from military service for one reason or another. And I've had interactions with some in the last 90 days. I wanted to serve my country, you know, and I passed through all the vetting and security check, but I had asthma in my background, or I had something else in my background that meant I was a no-go for entering the service. And I said, okay, when they tell you no, how'd you feel? I was really disappointed. And then did they say, hey, look, if you want to serve your country, you can still serve your country just because you can't come into the uniformed service. There's DOD civilian positions. There's an industrial base that are essentially in the foxhole with our active service in terms of the critical nature. And my interaction with people who've recently been turned away is no, they were given nothing other than I'm sorry, we can't let you in. I would hope that our services would direct patriotic people who want to serve this nation, who for one reason or another may not meet a qualification. I would hope that they might be directed to other parts of our defense ecosystem, because, you know, we need an awful lot of people. We need the tens of thousands who exit military service every year, who are going to go out into the big wide world and do anything. There's all kinds of opportunities for them to continue serving. And I think many of them know that, but an awful lot of people, based on my son's experience when he was the really green first lieutenant and had his first Marine platoon, and his sergeant came and said, I'm retiring in 60 days. What should I do to find a job? I mean, there ought to be ways to direct people into filling up these positions serving our country in the industrial base or the DOD civilian side. And I don't know that we're doing that. And I just would encourage you to see if we might be able to do that better. There's not a question there, but it's an encouragement. I do have a question about counter-UAS in my last minute. We've been having some testimony and some hearings, some open, some classified, about UAS challenges. And obviously they're a threat in combat, but increasingly they're also a threat to our installations, both at home and overseas. Addressing this threat requires an awful lot of coordination. If it's at home, it's usually between a city or county and a state and a local law enforcement agency, and maybe the DHS or the FBI, as well as a base commander and others. And I worry a little bit that we're maybe not really coordinating as we are thinking about how to deal with the UAS threat around our own bases, both domestically and those that are overseas, where you have a foreign government also to deal with in terms of what you can do. How are you satisfied with the degree of coordination that we are seeing in trying to get after and solve this problem? Any of you want to?
Senator, I'll answer that. In 17 seconds, I can give you about 15 back, because the answer is no, not satisfied. And the reason we're not satisfied is because although the services coordinate effectively together and leverage each other's capabilities, every single locale is its own story. And so there is no national approach to this counter small UAS issue. It is local issue by local issue.
I don't want to go over my time, but let me ask one other question really quick. If there was is there somebody in the Pentagon who I could like grab by the shoulders and say, hey, you're responsible for this, the coordination part of it? Admittedly, it's complicated with all the laterals, but you're responsible for this. Tell me what we're doing to really develop strategies. Who would I go to who is that person?
I could be one of them.
Okay.
Dr. Bill LaPlante, ANS, Undersecretary for Defense for ANS. He and I co-chair the session that kind of leads this on behalf of the Secretary of Defense.
Okay.
He stood up a Tiger team. That Tiger team's still in place. Bill LaPlante and I, and there's a couple other forums that do this, and all the services are part of that forum that Bill and I co-chair. But we would love to come back over and give you a deep dive on that, sir.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
But with that, let me turn it over to Senator Kaine.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to my committee members. I actually was really enjoying that. And Rep. Raskin, so good to have you here before us. This hearing reminds me of one that I had in the Foreign Relations Committee in early 2017, where we were considering the confirmation of Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, to be Secretary of State. And I asked him, Mr. Chair, a set of the same questions that this hearing is digging into, and he basically said that he couldn't answer them, even though he was well aware of what ExxonMobil had done in this space with respect to their obfuscation around climate science. And at one point I said, now, are you telling me you can't answer them or you won't answer them? And he was very honest. He said, yeah, I'm telling you both. And really it was more that he wouldn't answer them. And I can see why. The committee's investigative work has laid out a pretty important record, I think, of efforts by these companies to mislead the public. But what I want to focus my questions on is the efforts by the oil companies to mislead Congress or just not cooperate with Congress. And I understand in the House investigation, I'd like you to talk about this a little bit, Representative Raskin, that there was many, many instances of refusal to cooperate with the investigation by ExxonMobil and others. Could you just describe that a bit?
Well, when we first sent out the requests, as I was describing before, we got a mountain of minutia and distracting material, newsletters and press releases and so on. We then used our subpoena power to get more serious, and we got more serious answers, but still we had thousands of documents that were redacted in substantial and perhaps critical ways. That would be my suspicion. And there were entire documents that we never received at all. And this is why, I close my remarks by invoking Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, which is all about how if you have a small group in society that's invested in a particular model that's dangerous to everyone and they're allowed to get away with it, that becomes a telltale sign of a potential collapse of the society. And so when the United States Congress comes calling, you owe it to the Congress, the representatives of the people, to give the information. The Supreme Court has repeatedly found, you guys know these cases, I'm sure, McGain versus Daugherty is one of them, but the Supreme Court has been adamant that we have the right to get the information that we want in order to legislate. We're the representatives of the people.
I want to ask about one particular reason asserted by at least one of the companies, and maybe more, for not producing documents that I found kind of Alice in Wonderland-like. We are not going to give you these documents because sharing information would violate our First Amendment rights. Now, you are a constitutional law professor, and by my recollection, the First Amendment with respect to speech says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
Yeah.
It is a right, whether or not the First Amendment should have been applied to corporations, we'll set that one aside. Yeah. It has been applied, and so corporations have a right to speak. But the notion that a corporation would claim their First Amendment gives them a right not to share information, to hide information that they're embarrassed by, even in the face of a congressional subpoena, strikes me as like, that's the opposite of the First Amendment.
I think you're right. I mean, giving them their due, the Supreme Court has found in cases like West Virginia versus Barnett that there is a right not to speak against conscience. But the Supreme Court has always found that turning over documents is an objective act that doesn't compel you to do something against your own political ideas. So that would obviously lead to the end of our civil and criminal discovery system if the First Amendment gave you the right not to turn over documents.
Well, I was a trial lawyer for a while. I'm not one of John Kennedy's acumen or flamboyance. But I was a pretty good one.
I deny everything.
but I will say you can always tell when an objection is made if it is an extremely unpersuasive, novel, imaginative, unsupported objection. You can always tell there's something they really don't want you to see.
Yeah.
And I think that the investigation contains an awful lot of material that the public needs to see, but I can only imagine the extent of the iceberg under the water that you are not allowed to see. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair. Both, I want to just acknowledge some amazing work that the U.S. military has done in two very challenging contexts recently. The U.S. effort to support Israel, together with other nations, during the attack from Iran was truly a superb operation. And I don't think that kind of thing happens by accident or by chance. It demonstrates an awful lot of training, an awful lot of capacity, an awful lot of cooperation. And had we not been successful in that, the level of escalation that we might have seen in the region, the damage to Israeli cities, communities, people, the likely escalation thereafter could really have been devastating at a very critical time where the last thing we need is escalation in the Middle East. And so I just, at a hearing like this, I want to acknowledge the great service of U.S. military in forming together with Israel and other nations a defense against the Iranian attack. And second, the work that the U.S., primarily the Navy, but not solely the Navy, has done in the Red Sea to repel attacks by Houthis against commercial ships, military ships. Again, in tandem with allies, but most of the work is being, the hard work, the kinetic hostile fire is being taken by U.S. military has been truly remarkable. And the remarkable thing, and I know this has got to keep you guys up every night, is when we are sitting there in the Red Sea and absorbing incoming over and over and over again, we have to have 100% success rate. It can't be 98, can't be 99%. My understanding is it's been 100% up to now. I don't want to jinx it, and it's been, we've been as close as 3,000 yards from striking a U.S. ship that we were able to take down with a Gatling gun. Some use of missiles has enabled us to take down incoming missiles or drones at further distance, but 3,000 yards is pretty close. And we've got a lot of Virginians on those ships in the Red Sea, and I know other members here have sailors from their states there too. So I want to start with that, and that, it takes a lot of work to get to that. I mean, the development of the Aegis system, I mean, goes back decades, and good intel, and using the intel well, both to defend but also to strike positions in Yemen that could do damage. I mean, I just want to express appreciation. I do want to focus on the Red Sea, and so let me begin with Director Haynes. What does the IC assess about the Houthis' continuing threat on commercial shipping, and how long is that threat likely to remain active?
Yeah, so our assessment is essentially that it is going to remain active for some time. It is in part because Abdulmalik, the leader of the Houthis, continues, we think, to see domestic political advantage for some of the actions that he's taking, that he is interested in kind of burnishing his regional reputation, and he has seen this to be adding to that in many respects, and that they continue to indigenously produce a fair amount of UAVs, other weapon systems, and so on, and of course are also getting assistance from the Iranians in this respect, and that neither of those things are likely to change in the near future. Now, that doesn't mean that the strikes that the Department of Defense and the coalition with our allies have taken haven't had impact. They have, but it's been insufficient to really stop the Houthis from going down this road, and so that is sort of our...
What's your assessment about if there were to be a ceasefire in Gaza, what's the likelihood that the pace of attacks would significantly reduce?
Yeah, it is honestly unknown at this stage. They have indicated that at different times that they would comply with the ceasefire, so I think there's a fair possibility that that is what.
And wasn't there some abatement of the pace of attacks into the Red Sea during the ceasefire?
That's exactly right. They did in the prior one, but it's just one of the things that's been challenging is that their rationale for their attacks has shifted over time a bit, and it's gotten more complicated at times. He's indicated that they wouldn't stop unless and until humanitarian assistance had been delivered to a certain degree, things like that. And so it seems like there are additional requirements that he's added, but it doesn't mean that he wouldn't pause during the ceasefire.
And even if the ceasefire, might under past rationale lead them to stop, to the extent that they feel like this is, burnishing their reputation for being kind of a bad actor, they might continue even in a ceasefire condition.
Yeah, it's possible.
Last question. Why aren't more allies and members of the coalition helping the United States and actually taking military action against Houthis who are targeting their ships. I mean, we're protecting commercial ships of other nations. The number of nations that are participating in the military activity seems small to me. How should I understand that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start, and General Cruz may have more to add here. I think a number of them really are trying to help in any way that they can, and we've seen it come in different forms, you know, and I would really defer to the Department of Defense in terms of the degree of it, but let me...
How about a quick answer since I'm over my time, General Cruz?
Sir, I think I would just add that to the DNI's point, many of them are contributing in other ways, and there are important ways. And while there's few that might be doing defense in the Red Sea, specifically, they're doing things that we actually count on, and we appreciate the partnership, but would welcome anyone else who would want to participate.
Senator Cotton. Secretary Latorre and Admiral Franchetti, I want to begin with a question that goes back a ways, and that is the mental health of our sailors. As you know, and Secretary Del Toro, I thank you for accompanying me. In the Hampton Roads area in the last couple of years, we've had some serious issues with suicides among our sailors. And we had 2 different units in Hampton Roads, very different circumstances, but there were some commonalities. One, folks who were connected with the refueling of the George Washington, which was in dock for a very long time. And second, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Maintenance Center, 2/3 of whose personnel are sailors assigned to that billet, but 1/3 of whose personnel were sailors in the fleet who became assigned to the billet on a limited duty status because they were pregnant, because they had a physical injury, because they had a mental health issue, because they had a disciplinary challenge in the fleet. The suicides that happened at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Maintenance Center were all among the limited duty staff who were there for kind of an unknown period. They weren't, unless it was for pregnancy, people didn't know when or if they would be returning to the fleet, and they didn't know when they would know the answer to that question. And folks on the George Washington had trained for an MOS, you know, as a surface officer, and then they end up in a long-term status where the ship's in dock and they're not really doing the thing for which they trained. So in each instance, this grouping of suicides, and each one was different, of course, but the grouping of suicides happened among people who were probably experiencing a little bit of lack of purpose or confusion about their status. This committee has passed bills like the Brandon Act and in other ways tried to encourage more focus on mental health issues. Can you give us, the committee, a progress report on implementation of the Brandon Act? The Navy was first to move out on it, but also just more generally, what you're trying to do to make sure that people feel that sense of purpose and that they don't, their colleagues don't miss obvious signs that they need help.
Well, thank you, Senator. Thanks for your commitment to this cause, and it's a very important cause, the mental health of our service members, Marine Corps and the Navy. First, it starts with treating people with dignity and respect across the board. Specifically in regards to the limited duty status delays that existed, I would argue, a year ago or so, the CNO and the Commandant actually worked hard at trying to limit the amount of time that personnel have to actually spend in a limited duty status. But we've done a long list of other investments thanks to the lessons that we actually learned about sailors working in shipyards, and particularly the George Washington, that have led to tremendous improvements, and perhaps the CNO can comment on a few of those.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. And mental health is health. You know, we're really focused on all of our sailors and being able to contribute to the best of their ability every day to get after that warfighting spirit and be able to do the job that they came into the Navy to do. You know, after that, we stood up at the direction of the Secretary, quality of service cross-functional team to really dive into a lot of the challenges that were experienced by the sailors there in the Hampton Roads area, and we're continuing to make good progress on those. In terms of mental health specifically, though, we put out a mental health playbook. It's a really one-stop shopping for sailors at every level of leadership to be able to provide all the different resources available to someone, to be able to connect them, whether it's a chaplain, whether it's mental health, whether it's military family life counselors, to really no wrong door of folks being able to get assistance that they need. The other one is that we found, to reduce the stigma of potentially seeking assistance is to put the assistance closer. So we have 43% of our mental health and behavioral health techs are with our operating forces right now. And I would say the last one on LIMDO, we're doing a LIMDO sprint right now, but a couple of the things that we've done already are establishing a coordinator at each command to be able to really coordinate what each one of those people are doing. And then we're looking at what is the limited duty condition and what can they actually do to give them meaningful jobs, meaningful work, and that sense of purpose.
That's helpful.
Until that is remedied. The other last one is on the, looking very closely at our shipyard manning for extended overhaul periods to make sure that a sailor doesn't do their entire first tour enlistment in a 5-year overhaul, that they actually have an opportunity to go and do what they came in the Navy to do. Those are just a couple examples.
One last question very quickly. The industrial base is currently producing Virginia-class subs at 1.3 a year. We need to be 2 a year for our sake and 2.3 a year to meet our commitments to AUKUS. When, based on the current investment levels of ours and the Australian investment, when will we hit 2 a year, and when will we hit 2.3 a year?
Well, Senator, I'm proud to report that in the immediate, actually, we're at just slightly less than 1.4 now. So the investments that we have made in the shipbuilding industry and the submarine industrial base, for example, are starting to finally pay off. And keep in mind as well, too, the continuing resolution of 6 months delay prevented us from making those investments until just recently as well. So I'm hopeful that by 2028, 2029 period, hopefully, we'll be able to get back up to the 2.0, 2.33 production rate that's necessary to be able to support AUKUS and support our submarine base as well, too.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kaine. Senator Kramer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for your service.
Both love. You're from Appalachian, Tennessee, and I appreciate your continued dedication to the region. I'm going to be in Appalachian, Virginia tomorrow visiting the Allegheny Highlands Dental Center, a dental center that serves folks in Appalachia that we were able to receive a significant congressionally directed expenditure to help them. But in particular, I want to thank you for your work on remote access medical. So just to paint the picture for my colleagues and those who are here, remote access medical does dental clinics and other medical clinics in remote areas. One of the first sites and continuous sites, annual sites for RAM is the Virginia-Kentucky Fairgrounds in Wise County, Virginia. And beginning when I was lieutenant governor, I will often go to volunteer on this 3-day weekend of service. And what happens is people start arriving about Tuesday or Wednesday to park their car in a dusty county fairgrounds parking lot to get a number so that when it opens Friday morning, they can go in and get medical care. The first time I came, I was struck when I walked through the parking lot. I would have expected to see vehicles from Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and West Virginia and North Carolina. But I was surprised to see vehicles with license plates from Georgia and Florida and Alabama and even Oklahoma, because people, low-income people at that point, beginning in 2002, 2003, had to drive that far to get medical care. The clinic offers all kinds of medical care, but by far the most significant usage of the clinic are folks who are seeking dental care. And the most significant thing is teeth extraction. If you just look at the bucket where the teeth are extracted at the end of each day, I mean, it's just staggering the number of people who have to drive state through state just to have that happen. The numbers of people going to the RAM clinic declined when Virginia embraced Medicare expansion. Medicaid expansion, excuse me, that was positive. But because it's a border community and many of the surrounding states haven't done Medicaid expansion, there's still a lot of folks. But the numbers didn't decline on the people coming to seek dental care. For a variety of reasons. Dental care not being part of the essential health benefits yet. And Virginia has embraced in 2022 a Medicaid expansion for dental care, and Virginia has also done a salary supplement under Medicaid for those who are serving, and yet still only 27% of our dentists accept Medicaid patients. So it's clear that we have an awful lot to do. Medicaid expansion has really helped the folks who came to that clinic and come every year. But on the dental side, we need more operations like the Allegheny Highlands Center that I'm going to tomorrow and others. And I just appreciate the role that RAM has played in this safety net. You know, it's kind of RAM is at the first rung of the safety net, and then free clinics and community health centers. But in the nation that's probably the most powerful and wealthiest nation on the world, the fact that you'd have to drive through 3 or 4 states and park in a dusty parking lot and wait 3 days to get in line so you can have your teeth pulled. I mean, I was a missionary in Honduras when it was one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere next to Haiti.
you know, this was in 1980 and 81, and it's not that different from what you might see in the dusty parking lot in Wise County, Virginia, which is the area of the state that my wife is from. You said something, Dr. Simon, I wanted to follow up with you on, which is it's not just reimbursement, there's a cultural thing. Because you're right, if Virginia, we embraced Medicaid for dental services, we expanded it, and then the legislature put more money into increased reimbursement rates, and that's showing some success, but we still only have 27% of our dentists that accept Medicaid patients. You know, how do you view this cultural shift, any of you, and what might we do in addition to reimbursement increases to try to change that? I like who said if we can just get each, you know, dentist to take 5 Medicaid patients, right? And then that plus the safety net would help, but what can we do?
I'd also point out that the 27% number doesn't even paint the whole picture, because only 5% of Virginia dentists see more than 100 Medicaid patients a year. Yeah. So you have an extraordinarily small workforce who's really doing the work. 100 Medicaid patients is not very many when the average dentist has a patient panel of 1,500 plus patients. Mm-hmm. So really, it's an incredibly small group. So I think understanding from that group themselves how they're able to do that. I would imagine many of them work in community health centers or other settings where they have sort of more infrastructural support in order to provide this amazing care. But understanding the dentists who are able to do it is probably the first thing. The other thing, more big picture, would be to make a shift between fee-for-service to a value-based care model. Right now, dentists feel like they're not getting enough money for each procedure they do. But patients would benefit if they didn't need any procedures, and dentists make nothing if that's the case. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So a model that aligns patient and provider perspectives and lets dentists actually practice in a way that's more meaningful and preventive focused, I think is also
other nations do that, and they have much better health outcomes than we do. Any others that might want to comment on this issue about the culture shift, if my chair would enable me now that I'm over time to hear the answer?
Well, part of the cultural shift is to shift more towards prevention. Uh-huh. But to be able to teach people how to prevent disease and how disease are interacting with one another really requires increasing health IQ, and it means that you have to do it in a culturally sensitive way, even in Appalachia. That's a culture, and you have to be able to use that as a way to be able to educate people about prevention. If we don't do that, we're never going to be able to fix and put Band-Aids on all these situations.
Dr. Minter-Jordan.
I certainly would agree with everything that's been said. The focus on prevention and increasing and leveraging the use of ancillary providers within dental practices so that the dentist is focused on working at the top of their licensure and aided by ancillary providers in the office that helps to provide more access to Medicaid patients.
And then Dr. Isbell.
Yeah, you know, I think it comes down to education, Senator. I think it's about treating every patient that we can. I mean, there's in a practice like he's had and I have, there's only so many patients you can see. One of my associates treats the patients in the jail. Who wants to go do that? I mean, if you were a dentist, you're not going to want to do that. But guess what? They deserve care. How about our nursing home patients? We treat numerous nursing homes. We bring them in stretchers into our office to take care of them. And many of our elder care, they're coming in wheelchairs, but having the structure where it can be there. So it gets down to how much you can do. Our children, we see so many of our children. We go into the grammar schools and teach oral health literacy to our children. And then we send brochures home to try to get to the parents. How do you get to the parents? Because guess what? They weren't raised with that, Senator, and the parents don't understand. So it starts from the bottom level, teaching the child, teaching the parent, and every access that we can to give them an opportunity to understand what Dr. Swan has said. If there's so many things that we do in dentistry that by education and getting on there with just simple prevention, we can save so much for every family and prevent the catastrophic stories that we're all telling.
Well, I appreciate your service, your testimony, and thanks, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Ricketts. Secretary Blinken, thanks for your superb service and for being here today. I have 3 quick items, then I want to get back to Israel-Gaza on the humanitarian dimension. First, I really believe that Congress should lift its hold on the support to the multinational security force in Haiti, and I worry that the refusal to do that is really complicating our maybe small ability to push this in the right direction. If Congress does not release the hold on appropriated funds to fund this security force, what's going to happen?
Well, if we don't have those funds available, then it's going to be very hard to move forward with the security force. And look, again, I understand and respect those who express concerns about the success given the history, but I think we have a very clearly defined and achievable mission for the security force, which is to bolster the police and put them in a position where they can reassert effective control.
It was hard. It was hard work for you guys to get Kenya to agree to lead this. If we don't come through on our financial commitment, isn't it pretty likely that they'll back?
They will. They certainly will.
And then who would take up the mantle if the U.S. is not providing?
No, I think that's
support?
exactly right. The Kenyan president will be in Washington this week for a state visit. It would be good if we could fully deliver on our commitment. But second, I just say too, here's an instance where I know some people have concerns about the United States being the quote-unquote policeman of the world. Well, here's a situation where Kenya and a number of other countries have stepped up and are willing to take this on, but they need support.
Absolutely. Let me ask you a second one. This is very parochial. The State Department requested medical providers in Northern Virginia to snap together to provide medical services to Afghans coming into Dulles Airport. When Afghans came in the summer of 2021, they largely came into Dulles. 3 of the 8 resettlement sites were in Virginia, and we now have more Afghans than any other state from that initial wave, and we're proud of it. Our Afghans are doing great work. I've met some training to be shipbuilders. They worked with us in Kabul, and now they're training to be shipbuilders and help our industrial base. But the healthcare providers that responded to the State Department haven't been paid. They did all this medical service. It was about $630,000. It's not that big an amount. We've been asking over and over and over again that they be paid. We sent a letter to the State Department. It was bicameral in January. Haven't gotten a response back. Will you work with me to make sure that these folks who jumped to attention when the State Department asked are treated fairly, so that if you ask, they may do it again?
Happy to work with you on this. We have looked into this, and we have some further information that we can share with you. But the initial bottom line is that we had our procurement executive investigate this. We learned that the company in question acted apparently on its own, maybe out of very good motivation, but without any contractual agreement with the Department of State or with the Cherokee Nation in this case.
Well,
So
I
we
want
need
to follow up, because the ones that I'm talking about are folks who are directly requested.
I'm
by the
happy to
State
follow up with
Department.
you on that.
And then third, this is really for Senator Hagerty and me. We have a company, Vulcan, that's U.S.-based firm that's got presence in Virginia, Tennessee, and other U.S. states. They own a port and land in Mexico. AMLO has tried to appropriate that land twice, even with police and military invasions of the property. I'd rather not get into that now, but I would love your commitment to work with me to make clear to the Mexican government that appropriating the private property of American companies would be very bad for this important relationship that we have with Mexico.
Yeah, I believe that's subject to a proceeding in arbitration right now, but we certainly made the generic point to the government of Mexico, including to the president, that yes, seizure of private companies is not a good way to attract investment.
On Israel-Gaza, I think my colleagues, Senator Merkley and Senator Van Hollen, have dug into this, but I want to particularly focus on what I call Pillar 2 of NSM-20, which is a certification that a nation receiving U.S. military assistance is cooperating with U.S.-supported humanitarian efforts. I think the Pillar 1, making a determination about whether Israel is or is not using these weapons in accord with international law, is more complex. But on the humanitarian side, look, World Central Kitchen aid workers killed, other UN aid workers killed, settlers attacking humanitarian aid convoys on the West Bank, throwing stuff off the truck, setting the aid on fire, setting the trucks on fire. The U.S. having to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build a pier in Gaza. Virginians from Fort Eustis are building that pier and deployed to do it. All of that, to me, says you wouldn't have, none of that would be happening if Israel was fully cooperating. It took too long to open Kerem Shalom. It took way too long to open Erez. I think, my editorial opinion, you've already answered questions about this, certifying that on that record, the humanitarian efforts of Israel to help Gazans who are non-combatants, who aren't part of Hamas, is sufficient. I think that's grading on a curve that if that's sufficient, then anything's sufficient. I don't think it's anywhere near sufficient. I don't think it's in the time zone of sufficient. I agree it's more than was started. I mean, at the beginning, members of the Israeli cabinet said it was going to be a complete siege against Gaza. And I know that President Biden was able to get an agreement finally to open up the Erez crossing. But I think calling this state of affairs sufficient cooperation with U.S. humanitarian effort, I just think that demeans the credibility of the administration. And I think you should have said, you're not getting a passing grade on this, and then laid out what more needs to be done. The number of trucks going in. When Cindy McCain, the widow of a former member of this committee, talks about the famine that's resulting, I mean, I just don't see how the U.S. can say that's enough. I mean, I credit my colleagues of saying, let Israel defeat Hamas. Let Israel, with our help, knock down Iranian drones and missiles. I'm all for that. But the punishment of non-combatant civilians, the killing of aid workers, the ransacking of humanitarian aid convoys with the idea of doing very little to stop it, how can that be sufficient?
Well, we have, as you know, Senator, from day one, been working on this every single day. And that includes going back to October, getting the initial crossings open, including in October, Rafah, then later Kerem Shalom.
In December, 2 months later.
In December, yes. So this is
Erez in March or April.
Erez, crossing 96, the Jordanian route, et cetera. At the time of the report, the NSM, which, by the way, I applaud as, I think, an effective and helpful vehicle in terms of concentrating minds and focusing minds on this. I think we've seen that the assurances that we received in March, the question was, from the time we received those assurances to the time that the report was issued, did we judge them to be credible and reliable when it came to humanitarian assistance? And we saw during that period Israel take overdue but important steps to actually expand significantly the provision of humanitarian assistance.
On that statement, I don't disagree. They took steps between March and May, but I think the steps were still
and I think the report itself, if you read the report, as I know you did carefully, I think the report lays that out very clearly.
Well, I'm gonna call on Senator Scott because he's next, but I just think on the factual record, yeah, improvement since March, yes. I still think it falls so far below the hurdle that I don't think that warranted a passing grade. With that, I'm going to go to Senator Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Senator Kaine.
Thank you. Well, like many who spoke today, I think the Dobbs decision was a disaster, both in terms of the human consequences of it, but also the radical nature of undoing not just 50 years of Roe versus Wade, but 100 years of 14th Amendment precedent that began with cases like whether parents should be able to make their own choices about whether their kids go to parochial schools or not. Should parents be able to make their own choices about educating their children to speak German? Should people be able to marry who they want? And the Supreme Court's decision to cast out not just Roe, but then jeopardize all of these other rights that we've taken for granted for a century has had just a set of horrible consequences. I think we need a national protection. I have a bipartisan bill that would protect both Griswold and Roe and restore to where we are pre-Dobbs and make plain that your rights shouldn't depend on what zip code you live in. Your rights shouldn't depend on who your state legislature is. The notion in Dobbs that the Supreme Court said, but don't worry, you can go to your state legislature, when most of the state legislatures in the country, I mean, look at Congress, it's 26% women. That's cold comfort to say women's rights. Well, you can just count on the legislature to do it right when women are so underrepresented in most of our legislatures. And that's why we have a Constitution. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights is designed to protect core freedoms. Even if the majority is against you, there's something that you should get living in this country, even if you're just one person, that the majority can't trample upon. Virginia, thank goodness, is one of the states, one of the few states that essentially still follow Roe. There was the basic framework established by Roe, minimal regulation of abortion pre-viability, some more significant regulation post-viability. That's where Virginia is. Not everybody likes that. For some, it's not enough. For some, it's too much. But Virginia has basically done that, and that has put Virginia in an unusual position because we're the last state in the South. The last state in the South that really still provides women and all the rights that Roe guaranteed to them for half a century. Ms. Lopez, you alluded to this in your testimony, but there's an unusual burden in these instances where states like Virginia are protecting reproductive freedom, but surrounded by others that aren't. There was a story in the Washington Post recently, and I mean, here's an example. A woman drove from Houston, Texas to Fort Lauderdale, an 18-hour drive to access reproductive care. she hadn't heard that the Florida 6-week ban had gone into effect. So with no other option and 9 weeks pregnant, she then drove an additional 12 hours to Virginia to receive care. And after she legally was able to terminate her pregnancy at 9 weeks, she then had a 17-hour drive home back to Texas. It's just, I think, outrageous that we're making people do that. But talk a little bit about the burden with this patchwork of, some states protecting women's reproductive freedom and many states not.
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for the question. And as I stated in my testimony, now 1 in 5 abortion seekers are traveling outside of their state to places like Virginia to seek care.
And you said it was 160,000.
Yeah.
80,000 before Dobbs, 160,000.
Yeah, and so, and what we know is that, that increases in places like your state for our providers, that increases the number of patients they're getting. So both the residents that they're serving within their own state and now this influx of patients, which means that there's going to be an increased waiting time. So if you think about all of the barriers that someone having to leave their home community, figure out how they're going to pay for the procedure, take off work, find childcare, because most people who seek abortion are also parents themselves, go to an unfamiliar place, probably have to wait, and then also have costs on the ground. The financial, logistical, and ultimately the emotional barriers are ridiculous and sometimes insurmountable, and ultimately could be forcing some people to carry pregnancies to term.
And then finally, this is a hearing that is about how abortion bans have created a healthcare nightmare. That's the title of the hearing, but the Dobbs decision also impacted a whole lot of other rights. Again, this whole 14th Amendment jurisprudence since the mid-19-teens, including the right to contraception. In Virginia, because of the logic of the opinion, Virginia legislators, Sia Price and Ghazala Hashmi, two friends of mine in the Virginia General Assembly, introduced a contraception protection in Virginia law that was passed overwhelmingly by the legislature, but our governor vetoed it. Are you seeing other states, taking the green light of Dobbs to put into question contraception, in vitro, other important healthcare services?
Absolutely, Senator. Not just contraception, but efforts to defund Planned Parenthood continue, to limit or defund Title X, access to contraception for everyone, other restrictions on minors' access to care, IVF, and then we're also seeing, kind of similar efforts around transgender and gender-affirming care. Those are all interrelated and all efforts to limit access to basic reproductive health care.
Well, just as I conclude to my colleagues, Elizabeth Carr, the first child born via IVF in the United States, was born in Virginia in 1981, and I had her as my guest at the State of the Union. And she said when the Alabama Supreme Court rendered the ruling that then led the Alabama healthcare providers to stop IVF, she said, for the first time in my life, I felt like an endangered species. No one should be made to feel that way. Thank you. I yield back. Ranking Member Grassley, I'm going to take over the helm, but lest my head swell too big, I'm not going to take the chairman's seat. I'm going to do it from here. And I'm up next. Ms. Wood, I wanted to dig into your question. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your story. And tell me a little bit more. You thought moving to Tallahassee, farther away from the coast, where maybe the weather emergencies were less extreme, you thought that would be the solution, and yet why was that not the solution? You had a bad experience with this insurer that was going to cut you off without even telling you and not even sharing the information about your roof. You did find another insurer, but were there not companies in the Tallahassee area when you talked to them that would offer affordable homeowners insurance? And is that part of the reason why you've decided not to buy another home in Florida?
Thank you. When we knew that South Florida was kind of the epicenter of the weather disasters, the insurance problem, and we thought Tallahassee would be safer. Our daughter lives there. And we started looking for homes, and we started talking to people about their insurance problems, and they were basically repeating the same things that were happening down south at a lower level. We just, a few weeks ago in Tallahassee, had a freak thunderstorm come through, knock out the power to 70,000, 80,000 people for several days. And it wasn't a hurricane. It was a storm, a rainstorm. And then I started talking to people, how are you doing? What do you see here? And they all say they are seeing increased weather events where they live, where they didn't have that before.
One of the things about your testimony that's important is, you know, I'm a senior citizen now. You are too. You and your husband, you described the ability of seniors to just kind of tolerate an unknown upside increase in a big cost item like insurance is pretty darn limited. And so when you are worried about the unpredictability of upside, that hits seniors particularly hard. Dr. Sen, I have a question for you. When we talk about the impact of insurance on housing, we're often thinking about homeowners, but there's a significant impact to multifamily properties as well. I reached out to the Virginia Housing Agency, which is our housing financing agency that largely supports low and moderate income rental properties. And I asked about what they're seeing on projects that their agency finances. Across the 119 local jurisdictions on which they have sufficient data, 105 are averaging at least double-digit annual increases between 21 and 23, and 9 average triple-digit increases, including 2 in the Hampton Roads area near the Atlantic Ocean, Virginia Beach and Chesapeake. If you're a nonprofit developer or public housing agency serving low and moderate income families, and it's an important thing, these increases are really tough on the developer, and then they get passed on to a tenant, unlimited means. Are the same dynamics in play when we talk about multifamily insurance markets as in single family?
Yeah, so in Florida, similar set of insurers are sort of in both markets. And so I would expect similar dynamics play out. However, unfortunately, we haven't been able to explore this in as much depth, in part because the data on multifamily insurance is not granular enough for us to look at it in any sort of systematic way. And that's why collecting these data, the FIO NAIC call, needs to focus across all segments of insurance and collect these data in a systematic way so that we can look at them, because these issues are so much worse for people with low income. In the low-income segment, their premiums are the highest, and they've also sort of grown the most in the past few years. If I could also respond to Mr. Mulready on the point about regulators sort of looking at, and we shouldn't pay, rating agencies is not something that we need to look at. I would just point out that in Florida, if you look at the number of exams that the Demotech-rated insurers, that, by the way, have a 20% insolvency rate relative to 0% for traditional insurers, they get examined at the same rate as the traditional insurers like Farmers and Allstates get examined, which is not something that you would expect. If you're more risky, you would expect regulators to come look at them much more frequently. And the risk-based capital requirements that we have currently, which were designed in 1980s, they are just not sensitive enough to new risks like wildfire and hurricanes and so on, and also not as well designed for under-diversified insurance companies, because if so, all of these insurers were meeting the risk-based capital requirements. However, at the same time going insolvent at the rate of 20%. So those two things sort of don't really go hand in hand.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. It's today to mark up the original bill, the National Defense Authorizing Act for fiscal year 2025. We will hold this subcommittee markup in open session. I'm confident that based on the agenda today, we can publicly conduct the business without disclosing classified information or adversely impacting the process. But if there are members who want to raise anything, offer an amendment, or raise an issue that touches upon material of a classified nature, please defer that for the full committee's consideration. While the subcommittee is meeting in open session, the entire contents of the markup book are subject to amendment throughout the entire process of consideration by SASC and are therefore embargoed until passed by the full committee and then reported to the Senate. Traditionally, the subcommittee has used the chairman's mark as the markup vehicle. Without objection, we'll use the chairman's mark as a markup vehicle subject to amendment. Seeing no objection to that, it is so ordered. I remind members, if you want to call up an amendment for consideration, please identify the amendment by the amendment number. This courtesy will help eliminate confusion and speed up consideration of all amendments. Consistent with the practice and precedent of both this subcommittee and the full committee, there are a number of types of amendments that cannot be considered that will not be in order.
First, amendments involving a significant matter that's not within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee. Second, amendments that contain a significant matter not in SASC jurisdiction. Third, amendments that involve shared jurisdiction with another committee where when that committee has not agreed to consideration of the amendment for inclusion in the subcommittee's mark. And finally, amendments that would constitute an earmark. And further, it's been the practice that any amendment to add funding has to be accompanied by an offset. Accordingly, if any senator proposes an amendment that would increase spending, he or she must also identify an offset to pay for it. And unless the offset can be found within funding that is within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, the amendment needs to be offered before the full committee. All right, now just a few comments about the work of this subcommittee. It really means a lot to me to chair Sea-Power. Senator Hirono and I have sort of traded readiness and Sea-Power over the years, and I'm really happy to be the Sea-Power chair. And that's because the Navy and the Marine Corps are so important, both to the national security but to my Commonwealth. I'm really proud of the work and programs supported in Virginia, and I know all of you feel the same way about your Navy and Marine investments, activities, personnel within your own states. This mark focuses on modernization and capabilities of the sea services and includes some important priorities: investments in the shipbuilding industrial base, strengthening workforce development initiatives, investments in new technologies to maintain dominance while also modernizing the Navy and Marine Corps. Further, it's important to note the role that the Navy plays to enable many partnership alliances. We spent a good bit of time last year talking about AUKUS. This subcommittee's work is very connected to the importance of that alliance as well as others. So we've got to continue to make these investments to meet our own obligations, but also to partner more deeply and maintain our commitments with partners and allies. Before I proceed, I do want to thank personal office staff and the committee on both sides who've continued to work together in a real bipartisan way. All items in the subcommittee markup have been agreed to by both sides without exception. And this includes Caitlin, Roberto, and Maha from my staff, as well as my defense fellows, Angelica and Ryan, and Colby and Hakela from Senator Kramer's staff, and then Eric, Pat, Christina, Creighton, Jenny, Griffin, Katie, and Noah from the committee staff. The subcommittee markup package before us consists of 14 legislative provisions, 13 special interest provisions, 16 budget items, and I'm very proud of that work. At this point, I ask the ranking member, Senator Kramer, for his opening comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree. It's nice to have you and Senator Hirono switching off. I get to work with both of you and I've enjoyed it both times. And as awkward as it is for a member from the Center of the North American continent to be on the Sea-Power subcommittee, much less the ranking member, nonetheless, I agree with everything you just said, and which is part of what makes this committee and this subcommittee, I think, so special, is that we are going the same direction. This markup does address a wide range of procurement, sustainment, research, development programs, and needs that directly support our sailors and our Marine Corps, for sure. But I think we need to do a lot more. I believe that more funding is required to provide our Navy and our Marine Corps with the resources needed to implement the defense strategy and to keep pace with inflation. Fiscal year 2025 will be the first time that we procure 6 or fewer battle force ships in 17 years. Let me say that again. First time that we procure 6 or fewer battle force ships in 17 years. It also plans to reduce the Navy's tactical aircraft to the fewest number in 17 years. And I hope we can make bipartisan progress in this area at the full committee markup and believe firmly that support of Senator Wicker's budget amendment will help us get Sea-Power priorities back on track. In addition, I support the legislative provisions in this mark that reinforce best practices in Navy and Marine Corps acquisition strategies. For example, the bill would improve ship design maturity, ensure a better balance of risk sharing on long-term shipbuilding contracts, and move away from just-in-time supply of parts to enhance ship readiness. This bill also supports near-term sea lift solutions to accelerate Marine Corps efforts in force design. And I'm just going to put a big exclamation mark on what the chairman said about alliances. You're exactly right. It's always been our strength, and it needs to continue to be, and we need to do even more of it. With that, I'll just wrap up by agreeing 100% without naming everybody one more time, the incredible staff work. Thank you for recognizing the staff, the personal staff and the committee staff on all sides. It's a great team, and I'm proud to be part of it.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. We'll now move to considering the manager's package. There's 8 amendments that have been cleared by both sides. You might have noticed that, like in personnel or readiness, it's 50 or 60 amendments. Traditionally, the number of cleared amendments in the C-Power subcommittee is smaller because most amendments are expensive and they get kicked to the full committee. But there are 8, and I'm just going to describe them quickly. King 13 is modified, which is regarding reports concerning warship planning, design, and construction practices. Tuberville 53 is modified, supporting ship repair grant program. Kramer 60 is modified, modifying the requirement to incorporate advanced degaussing technology into destroyers. Kramer 61 is modified to modify used vessels authority. Schmidt 95 is modified, requiring a report on undersea cable posture. Kaine 197, a sense of Congress on aircraft carrier acquisition strategies. Sullivan 218 is modified, modifying procurement authority for certain amphib programs. And Sullivan 539 is modified to clarify authorities related to expansion of shipbuilding infrastructure in the Navy. I decided to read all those to make a point. Almost all are modified. And what that means is, you know, senators and their staffs have good ideas and they submit them, and then they engage in this dialogue across the aisle and with staff to take a good idea and make it a completely agreeable idea. And I commend all the staffs and the senators for having good ideas, but then being willing to modify them to make sure that they fit and they get in the manager's package. Is there any objection to adopting these 8 amendments? Without objection, the manager's package is adopted. Are there any other amendments that members want to bring forward? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion that the subcommittee, we've already adopted the manager's package. All right. So what we will now do is I move that the recommendations of the subcommittee be reported to the full committee, and that the staff be authorized to draft bill and report language implementing agreements reached today and to make necessary technical and conforming changes. Is there a second? Second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. The motion is agreed to. Is there any other business to come before the subcommittee? With that, the subcommittee is adjourned. See you this afternoon. Thank you to the chair and ranking member, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I'm going to continue on Israel-Gaza. Israel has a right to defend itself, and the U.S. needs to be a partner with Israel in defending itself against those who would annihilate it. Hamas, Iranian-backed militias, Hezbollah, Houthis, Iran itself. I celebrated on April 14 when the U.S. helped Israel, together with other nations, knock down drones and missiles fired from Iran into Israel. Palestinians have a right to live. Palestinians have a right to live and not to be collectively treated as if they're part of a terrorist group when they're not. Most in Gaza are not Hamas. The vast majority in the West Bank are not Hamas. And while I support the U.S. effort to give Israel tools to defend itself against those who would annihilate it, I have been disappointed and expressed it publicly that the Israeli effort to support humanitarian aid to civilians, Israeli discussion about a future for Palestine, the slow pace of allowance of aid, the commission of violence against Palestinians on the West Bank, in some instances escorted by IDF reservists and Border Patrol officials, make this look to many that it is not just a defense against Hamas, but that it is a larger effort to target Palestinians. The administration, at Senator Van Hollen's request, and others of us joined in that request, in February announced a new policy, National Security Memorandum 20, that required recipients of U.S. military aid to meet 2 criteria. First, that the military aid would be used in accord with international law, and second, those receiving military aid, any nation receiving military aid, had to cooperate with U.S.-supported humanitarian efforts. The administration certified that Israel was meeting both of those pillars of NSM-20. The first pillar about whether military aid is being used in accord with international law is a murky one because of the way Hamas embeds in civilian populations, but I'll be blunt. I don't think the second pillar regarding humanitarian aid is that murky. And this is what I want to engage with you on. If Israel was engaged in sufficient effort to provide humanitarian aid, the U.S. wouldn't have to be building a jerry-rigged pier off the coast of Gaza, deploying Virginians from Fort Houston and elsewhere to do it. You would see a higher pace of humanitarian aid being delivered through border crossings in Israel into Gaza. You would not see Cindy McCain, the widow of a former Senate Foreign Relations Committee member, executive director of the World Food Program, saying that there's, quote, full-blown famine in northern Gaza. I don't think you'd see USAID Administrator Power publicly stating that it's credible to assess that there is famine in Gaza. The news since Sunday has been that the Israeli Defense Forces want to do a strategic pause in some military operations in Gaza every day to allow humanitarian aid to get to more Palestinians, and they are being attacked by Prime Minister Netanyahu and members of the cabinet for their effort to do some pauses in Gaza to allow humanitarian aid. So as the leader of our State Department and USAID in this remit, how can we conclude that there is sufficient humanitarian aid being allowed by Israel into Gaza on this set of facts?
Senator, thank you for that set of comments and questions. I wouldn't say there is sufficient humanitarian aid going into Gaza by no stretch of the imagination, but it is not because Israel is trying to impede it. There are a whole set of complex factors at work, among which is the extremely poor security conditions, for instance, on the other side of Kerem Shalom. I was on a long discussion, a phone call this morning with our embassy in Jerusalem, as well as our special envoy, Lise Grande, and she and we are working assiduously to help untangle some of the issues, and some of them are quite difficult to get at, because as the IDF has stepped back, various violent actors have stepped in, to the point that even the much diminished Hamas enforcers cannot get control of independent families and gangs and so forth. So that is a huge piece of what is going on right now. The risk factors for humanitarian workers are at the very uppermost levels of intolerability for the UN and other NGOs. But we're working across the board on these issues with the Israeli government, with the IDF, with COGAT, and they are doing these pauses. There's obviously a lot of politics at play around many issues related to Gaza, but the fact is we are getting partnership and cooperation. It's just a fraught situation.
I'm over my time, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I don't want us to lose credibility. You know, we can't control the activities of other nations, but we can control our own. And when we render a conclusion that Israel is sufficiently cooperating with the United States on the delivery of humanitarian aid, at the same time as we're having to spend hundreds of $millions on a star-crossed effort to build an unworkable pier to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. And if we render a conclusion that Israeli actions are sufficient when the Israeli government is engaged in a significant war of words against their own IDF trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza, where it makes us look like that we lose our own credibility by blessing an effort that is thus far entirely insufficient. I yield back. Witnesses, this is a really important topic. I think I have some Virginia teachers in the room, maybe some from Fairfax. They recently had a collective bargaining vote that I applaud you on. The title of this hearing is long. The piece I'm interested in is teacher shortages and everything that contributes to them, and you've all talked a little bit about that. My wife is a member of the Virginia State Board of Education appointed by the governor to oversee K-12 schooling in Virginia. She's the last one on the board appointed by a Democratic governor. Everyone else on the board is appointed by the current Republican governor. But I can tell you the one nonpartisan issue they grapple with is teacher shortages all over the Commonwealth. All over the Commonwealth, particularly in high poverty schools. There was a study in UVA, out of UVA this spring, 80% of all vacant positions were in the 20% of schools with the greatest number of vacancies. And those schools tend to be high-poverty schools, which tend to be either within central cities or in rural Virginia. Some of the shortages are acute in some areas. Special ed is a topical area where the shortages are acute, but they're generally acute in high-poverty schools. The students who most need good teachers in the classroom are the students likely to be in schools with high numbers of vacancies. And I think you've all done a good job of kind of explaining some of the challenges. One thing that was not mentioned that I do think should be mentioned is teachers' fears for their own safety. Some of you touched upon it, but no one mentioned gun violence. Nobody mentioned gun violence. Teachers do active shooter drills with their kids. That wasn't the case when I was in school. It wasn't really the case when my kids were in the Richmond public schools. It's the norm now. And a teacher said to me recently, we all do a moment of silence now. And I don't know what the kids are thinking about, but I know what every adult in a school is thinking about during the moment of silence. And it's let today not be the day. Let today not be the day. And that's got to be daunting for teachers and other adults who work in school systems, just like it's daunting for parents. My kids went to an urban school system, probably 90% free and reduced lunch. I didn't worry when I dropped them off in the morning about picking them up at the end of the day. I didn't worry about it. And they finished school just 15 years ago, but this is something that parents worry about now, teachers worry about now, kids worry about now. I was going to ask that question, Mr. Keyes, about the pathway program, because I think that really is a solution. Senator Collins and I have a bill called the PREP Act that looks at grow your own, because if somebody has been a paraprofessional in the school system and has demonstrated the ability to compassionately deal with all kinds of students, but they don't have the credential yet to be a teacher, you know they're going to be a successful teacher if you can get them to that credential. So I'm a big supporter of programs like the one you describe, and we do have bipartisan legislation to try to advance that here. Mr. Arthur, I wanted to ask you about a part of your background, which was national teacher certification. Dr. Kerwin talked a little bit about this. My experience in Virginia, but I'm wondering about the Utah experience, is every once in a while in Virginia, we would do a one-time bonus for people that got national teacher certification. But then if the budget was bad next year, it would disappear. So you wouldn't get a continued salary bump, and the person who wanted to get board certified next year wouldn't have that incentive to do it. I think while teacher salary is something that is primarily a state and local responsibility, I think it could at the federal level be a federal thing. We're talking about national certification. If we wanted a high percentage of our teachers to have national certification, that could be something at the federal level that would be smart to incentivize. Talk a little bit about, were you incentivized in Utah to do this? Did you just take it on because you wanted to do it? What was the Utah program under which you became certified, and did it increase your salary?
Absolutely, Senator. I receive a stipend every year, both from my district and my state. When I first went through national board certification, I did so just because I wanted to be better for children. I was motivated by what I was seeing in the classrooms of national board certified teachers. But when someone told me I would get paid more, I was like, okay, all right, that's nice. I won't have to ask my wife so much for the money. And it's not much. It's not enough right now to move people into this. I get about, roughly in Utah, about $4,000 extra year, or every year, because I teach in a Title I school, and I teach in a district that supports that, but not all districts do. States have different programs for this. So if there was a way to make sure that teachers across our country were all incentivized to become the most accomplished educator that they could be, the benefits to our children, the research shows, would be profound.
And Dr. Kerwin, again, remind me of, in the Maryland plan, what you do around national board certification.
When a teacher becomes board certified, they get an increase in salary of $10,000. And that continues in their salary. It is independent of the year. That's part of their base as long as they are board certified. So when they have to be renewed, they continue. And Senator Kaine, it's had a very interesting consequence. I just learned today, in fact, that Maryland led the nation in the number of teachers who got board certified last year. Maryland is a relatively small state, 6 million people, but it led the nation, more than California, more than New York. And I think that that salary increase has been obviously played a big role in making that happen.
And if I could, it's a salary increase, but it's a salary increase for doing a lot of work that makes you a better teacher. And the salary increase, even in your case in Utah, where it's somewhat modest, it's a sign of respect. Yeah. It's a sign of respect for the profession. And so I think that has a number of positives. And
Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Chair Sanders and Ranking Member Cassidy, and thanks for this wonderful testimony, extremely illuminating. I want to dig into two issues, medical debt and parents, and then medical debt related to dental costs. Ms. Ward, I'm going to start about medical debt with parents and ask you a question. High medical costs connected to pregnancy and childbirth are significant financial burdens for new moms and new parents. About half of births in the country are covered by private insurance, and 2022 analysis of claims data suggests that out-of-pocket costs for moms about $3,000 in addition to other costs that they incur. A recent survey of people experiencing healthcare debt found that parents generally are significantly more likely than non-parents to have healthcare debt because of their own or their children's condition. And the debt that's being reported for moms does not include other medical debt that they may have incurred for the children. This is just around childbirth. Medical care for infants can result in higher out-of-pocket costs and debt. And then the out-of-pocket costs connected with pregnancy and childbirth, particularly for new parents, come at a time when families are experiencing income loss. If you work with one of the 75% of the employers in the country that doesn't often offer paid parental leave, and also if you're looking for childcare in a nation that doesn't do a very good job of funding affordable childcare, having a child puts this kind of triple whammy effect on you. The ordeal that you and your family face sounds very harrowing, and you mentioned in your testimony that you were forced to ration care due to the financial impact of these outstanding hospital bills. Talk a little bit about how debt relief would have impacted the lives of you and your family as your children were young.
I think the main thing is that some of our care and some of our expenses were not just related to the hospital care. It came later for therapy and other kinds of treatment. So I think if we had had the opportunity to have debt relief, we would have pursued those therapies sooner, or we would have continued all the necessary treatment that was recommended for the children in a way that was consistent with what their treatment plan looked like.
So this, if we could figure out a path forward on debt relief, this would be a very pro-parent, pro-family, pro-child policy, and I think that's an important thing. And I want to ask Dr. El-Said a little bit about dental bills. Senator Baldwin and I in March led a letter from a group of colleagues to the administration about persistent coverage gaps in essential health benefits. We asked the administration to initiate rulemaking to institute a minimum standard of coverage and to establish a permanent structure to regularly review what essential health benefits are. Not long after receiving our letter, the administration issued a final rule expanding access to dental benefits by finalizing measures to allow states the option to add routine adult dental services as an essential health benefit. So for the first time, every state will be able to update their EHB benchmark plans to include routine, non-pediatric dental services, cleanings, diagnostic x-rays, restorative services like fillings and root canals. I hear from Virginians about this all the time, problems with lack of dental care, distance from dental service provision leading to huge health and other challenges. In your testimony, you mentioned that dental bills are one of the leading causes of medical debt, with almost half of adults reporting them as the cause of their medical debt. We've taken a small but important step in updating the EHB to allow for dental coverage. Can you speak to the impact that debt related to dental bills has on your patients?
Yeah, Senator, thank you for your leadership. I'll tell you, we do this weird thing in this country where we decapitate the head from the body. So if it's health care for your teeth or your ears or your eyes or even your mental health, we consider it something different and apart. But we all know what happens if you decapitate a body. Thank you for your leadership on this front, because I do hope that states will take up the mantle of including this as an essential health benefit. We often think about teeth as being something separate and apart because it feels like what happens in the mouth stays in the mouth, except for we all know also that the mouth is the gateway to the rest of the body. And we know that patients with significant dental caries or other oral pathology are far more likely to suffer long-term chronic health illness. You know, you think about something like heart disease related. You think about something like lung disease, also related. And so being able
and if I can interrupt, sometimes a dental examination also reveals non-dental health conditions that are really important to catch early.
You're correct. You think about oral cancer, often diagnosed at a dentist. So, you know, part of the responsibility here of thinking about debt is thinking about debt collectively, rather than making the mistake of, again, decapitating the head from the body. As we think about medical debt, given the statistic that you shared, nearly half of medical debt attributable to dental care, we need to be thinking about it collectively.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Senator Budd.
Thank you to my committee colleagues, and congratulations to our nominees. You each have decades of public service where you have really climbed to the pinnacle of your respective fields, and I am very happy to be able to support your nominations. But what I'd like to know is, based on your past experiences, as you look at them, what are accomplishments that you are the proudest of, and how would you bring lessons from those accomplishments to the positions to which you've been nominated? Dr. Solmeyer, if you could begin.
Thank you, and good morning, Senator. You know, when I think about what I'm most proud of in this field, it's the teams I've been able to build and be a part of, not just in academia, but now with the U.S. Army. Several of them are here today to experience this, and you know, we've been able to use the hiring authorities that this committee and the Congress has given the department in really creative ways, and I don't think I would be able to do that without the being empowered by the committee and the Congress to do so. So that's what I'm most proud of going forward.
Thank you. Ms. Wilkerson.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for the opportunity to share about a key accomplishment. You know, as I look at my tenure as the Deputy Director of NGA, I would say the key accomplishment has been being able to strengthen the stewardship of GEOINT resources. So I am the senior champion for that. And what that really has focused on is thinking about how we're postured organizationally, driving culture change, if you will, to think about the governance structure that needs to be in place, how we ensure we are able to provide the very best financial management artifacts, and as part of that, also strengthening our relationship with Congress.
Thank you. Ms. Wilkerson, I'm going to stick with you. As a leader in the intelligence community, you've witnessed a lot of changes over the course of your career about the way we respond to different kinds of threats. One of the key advantages we have over our adversaries is that we invest heavily in innovation and emerging technology. In Virginia, we're really proud of the Ravenna Station work being done down in the Charlottesville area, where we have great partnership between academic institutions, industry partners, and then government agencies. And those partnerships help us drive innovation. How would you build on the success of our centers of innovation like Ravenna Station in your new capacity?
Senator, I had an opportunity to visit Ravenna Station not that long ago, and I couldn't agree with you more that it's fantastic work that happens there, and I do think it is because of the partnership that happens with academia. I do, from an NGA perspective, one of the things that we've been focused on is educational partnership agreements, and also leveraging cooperative agreements that would allow for development activities as well, so that academia gets insight into what the mission requirements are, and there's an opportunity for early engagement. I would, if confirmed, certainly want to continue to build upon that, and then also not lose sight of the opportunity that the small businesses also provide to be able to tap into innovative concepts that we might not otherwise consider. That's part of my current portfolio and one that I've been very passionate about.
I was impressed when we talked the other day and you talked about NGA's partnership with Gallaudet and even high school students coming in to start to learn about work that's being done as a way to attract people into a talent pipeline into your agencies. Dr. Solmeyer, I think you might have referred to this before I came in the room. It was at another event this morning, but AUKUS, I'm a big AUKUS fanatic. I guess because subs are built in Virginia, I'm on both Armed Services and Foreign Relations, and a lot of the legislation to put AUKUS into place kind of straddled the two committees. I'm particularly interested in the kind of open field of Pillar 2 of AUKUS, how we can work together with these allies on innovative new technologies. Talk a little bit about the way you see AUKUS and particularly what we might do in the Pillar 2 space to advance safety and security in the Indo-Pacific?
Absolutely, Senator. So AUKUS really gives us this opportunity to see how the three countries can work not just as great intelligence partners, but now really as militaries in cyberspace. And that is, as you say, open field running. And so from training, exercising, capability development, those are the three areas where I would look if confirmed in the Pillar 2 area for cyberspace.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Campbell, good to have you. A comment and two questions. So the comment is in a response to an earlier question, you talked about the real importance of focusing on the global south, and of course we should, Africa and the Americas. 32 of the 35 youngest countries in the world are in Africa, and the population growth there, as well as a whole lot of other factors, make it a really important area of strategic focus. And in the Americas, the challenges we have at the border, the challenges with fentanyl, just everyday Americans' concerns about the globe often are issues related to the Americas and political instability there. And yet, we say that a lot, but we're just not doing it. The Article 1 branch, we have to own the absence of confirmed ambassadors, more than 20 openings in the Americas and in Africa. But the Article 2 branch, I just came from the hearing about the 2022 National Defense Strategy. That strategy has one paragraph about the entire Western Hemisphere, not much more about Africa. We are actually reducing military investments in AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM. They continually raise that they are under-resourced. We had an opportunity in the area of the world I'm most familiar with, the Americas. We had a real opportunity in Ecuador following a popular election that threw out a longtime pro-China government to step up and help Ecuador be a success story, a pro-democracy success story. The previous president said, all you got to do is put me in a trade deal. I'm the only nation on the Pacific coast of the United States, of the Americas, that doesn't have a trade deal with the U.S. Ecuador didn't have one because of the pro-China government that had been in place for 25 years. We didn't do it. We basically, the administration, and I strongly support this administration, but the view is that trade deals aren't good politics. We didn't do the one thing that President Lasso was asking us to do, and now we have a much more complicated situation in Ecuador. So the comment that I'm going to make, and then I'll move to a question, is we talk about the global south a lot, but if you measure it by resources, if you measure it by energy or focus, we are going backwards, not forwards. And that really, really troubles me. Now, my question is this. On the fentanyl topic, in November of 2023, Presidents Biden and Xi met in Woodside, California, and they talked about steps that China might take to begin helping us interdict fentanyl by blocking precursors, largely from coming into Mexico. 9 months later, what's the report card on whether those commitments by China are being met or not?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, just on your first questions, when you travel around, you are left with, particularly in the global south, with a sense of there's so much more to do, and there is a concern, as you suggest, Senator, that maybe we're going in the other direction. And I, as a person who has long supported the Indo-Pacific, I recognize that we're moving more of our capacity there, but I don't think we should be shortchanging our engagements in Africa or Latin America. It will come back to haunt us. So I share those issues. I believe in them as well. I will also say that, we talk about contesting narratives that the Chinese and the Russians promulgate in the global south. The dominant one that the Chinese and Russians use is the idea of American decline. And those views can be pernicious, and frankly, they can use disinformation, and they can also use headlines from our own newspapers. And I think one of the things that I would suggest is that when we come together in bills or activities that suggest national purpose and a degree of consensus, that's the area that we've largely been the strongest. I see that more, frankly, now in the Indo-Pacific than I do in the global south. My hope is this committee in the future will help us think about bipartisan approaches that are not just about military, but are about our levers of ability to invest, diplomats just across the board. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here. So the best grade I could give on the fentanyl, I was at Woodside, I was involved in this diplomacy closely, would be an incomplete. There are some modest steps that the Chinese have taken. There are some criminal prosecutions they've undertaken. They've wrapped up a few of the companies involved. I do just want to underscore how challenging this is. These are there are a large number of precursor chemicals and a large number of companies. They are innovative. They are moving around Asia. I think one of the reasons that China is addressing this issue is not just because we've asked, but Congress has been deeply engaged as well. Frankly, probably the visit of Senator Schumer and the team to China in advance of that had as much of impact than anything that we have done. But I would also say it is the case that synthetic opioids are not just affecting the United States. Europe and parts of Asia and China as well. This is a global scourge. I think increasingly the Chinese recognize that since so much of that is coming from manufacturers in China, that they have to take more steps. They have not done so to date, and we need to stay on them. And this is a critical national security issue for us. I commend you for raising it and focusing on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Kaine, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. It's good to be back before you. Ambassador Edelman, 11 times testifying here, and Jane, probably about the equivalent. We should give you guys some steak knives or something. I mean, very helpful report. A couple of thoughts before I have some questions. Ambassador Edelman, you mentioned your testimony earlier when you talked about potential for nuclear collaboration between China and Russia. You were kind of criticized for that. And I remember that. And frankly, the Pentagon, during the entire time I've been here, beginning in 2013, when we asked questions about the possibility of cooperation between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, they've kind of poo-pooed the idea as if historical enmities or border disputes or the past would block them from being able to work in a collaborative way. And I've always found that dismissive attitude naive. And I think that the results of today are showing the degree to which these nations, seeing the U.S.'s strong alliances, realizing they don't have them, they're drawn closer and closer together. There may be barriers to the level of cooperation, but we shouldn't assume those barriers are going to inhibit significant collaboration. And I think that's one of the aspects of your testimony, your joint testimony in the report, that's very powerful. I did chuckle at one of the punchlines, which is that we need to do a lot more defense spending and bring the deficit down too. We hear that punchline at a lot of hearings in a lot of different committees, but that's why, that's why we get elected to do what we do, and there are tough choices to be made. Here's a question that I have. If you asked American public, and I do think educating the public about the challenge is important. If you said, what's the most important national security threat today? I bet the top one would be fentanyl. I think before just the American public would cite Ukraine or would cite the possibility of a war against Taiwan, I bet they would say fentanyl. The National Defense Strategy in 2022 had one paragraph about the Western Hemisphere. You have a section dealing with Africa and Latin America that is a much longer paragraph. I like that. And yet it's about Africa and Latin America, and it talks about the fact that China and Russia are making Africa and Latin America real centers of activity. And as the chairman of the Americas Subcommittee on Foreign Relations, when I travel in the Americas again and again and again, from governments left, right, center, or unpredictable, what I hear is we'd rather work with you than with China, for example, but you're not present. Yeah, we appreciate you lecturing us not to accept a free 5G system from China, but what do you have on the table? We appreciate you telling us not to allow Russia to help with port investments, but what do you have on the table? And I think the fact that we spend so little intellectual energy focusing on our own hemisphere And I just match that up against, I think the American public would say fentanyl is like the biggest challenge, national security challenge that they see every day. Now, this committee's done some good work. We have done significant investments in fentanyl interdiction technology. I had a chance to see some of it that is being piloted in Brownsville about 2 weeks ago that I think will really help us. But, and Senator Ernst and I in last year's NDA did a provision that calls for greater mill-to-mill cooperation between the United States and Mexican militaries on the fentanyl issue. But why don't we just spend more energy on the Americas? What blocks us from more focus in the hemisphere? And I just worry we can't see at our own backyard to, especially Chinese investments, and count on our ability to lecture about the danger of Chinese investments to carry the day.
I agree, and I think we all agree. We did meet the head of Southcom, we met the head of AFRICOM, both of whom told us that we're investing in Latin America and in Africa.
And just in Africa, a stat. Of the 35 youngest countries in the world, 32 are in Africa.
Well, and
so in terms of a youth bulge and a growing population, I mean, this is where the future is.
I think the population in Africa is going to double by 2050, and it will be the most populous continent, I think, in the world. I'm not positive that it will exceed China and India, but I think it will. And we're underinvesting. And in South America, for example, we heard that there are 5 countries with no ambassadors, no confirmed ambassadors. And our military footprint in Africa is decreasing. I think we all agree on this commission that investment has to improve. And again, our whole idea about all elements of national power has to include partners and allies in those regions. Not an afterthought, not to say, oh yeah, about Africa and South America. And on fentanyl, I believe that President Biden and President Xi, when they met in San Francisco, came up with some deal on China policing the precursors of fentanyl, which come into our country mostly, I think, through Mexico. That deal hasn't been fully implemented, but it's a start. And it's absolutely important, given how devastating fentanyl is to young people in this country who take drugs unsuspecting that they're laced with fentanyl. It's absolutely crucial as a national security threat to us that we do more.
Thank you. My time is up. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kaine.
Your careers, just reading about each of your experiences really warrant significant admiration and appreciation from the committee. I want to spend my time with Mr. McIntyre and Mr. Nitschke, talking about PEPFAR. Eswatini has the highest HIV adult prevalence rate in the world at 25.9%, and girls and young women aged 15 to 24 account for almost half of new HIV infections. Lesotho has the second highest prevalence rate in the world at adult prevalence rate at 19.3%. And the good news is that rate is a good bit lower than it was 10 years ago. In 2013, the rate was 24.6%. We marked the 20th anniversary of PEPFAR in 2023. We're in a short-term mode of extending a year at a time. PEPFAR has saved countless lives in Eswatini and Lesotho. That reduction in Lesotho in particular demonstrates that and has supported significant progress in the treatment and prevention of HIV/AIDS. There's been some debate here about what we do with PEPFAR, but can you just describe generally the importance of PEPFAR funding to these two nations where you will be serving?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. PEPFAR is our leading investment in Eswatini. I've had almost 10 years of working with the PEPFAR program. I meant what I said in my testimony. It changes lives. It saves lives. I did want to thank you for your comment regarding women and children. I think sometimes that needs more focus. I think that's where we can do a better job in Eswatini. I absolutely pledge, if I'm confirmed, PEPFAR will be one of my priorities. It's an incredibly important program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nitzke.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I'm echoing my colleague that the importance of PEPFAR has been transformative. It may be the single greatest achievement of U.S. foreign development assistance in the 21st century. It has transformed and saved millions and millions of lives around the world. Our investments in Lesotho are on par as the largest investment that we make as a government, and it's transformative. Echoing my colleague's comments about the importance of addressing young girls and women in particular as an issue, but also I think it's important to note that when you think about these programs, engaging with youth who do not remember what the pandemic was like 15, 20 years ago, those who don't remember the coffin industry, the businesses that were taking off. Working in Africa in that time period, I remember having a funeral to attend on behalf of my local staff routinely because we lost people that we were working with. We didn't talk about what it was then. We didn't necessarily know, or the stigma was there. That's changed, and that's changed because of the investments that the U.S. taxpayer, this committee, this Congress has made on the continent. And I think we should be very proud of that. Thank you.
I think it's an amazing bipartisan achievement, and there's some controversy around reauthorization attending to different points of view about abortion, but PEPFAR isn't about abortion at all. And I hope we can resolve it. One last question on this topic. We are in a mode where we sort of do it a year at a time, but you can't really count on it long term. Talk about the difference in a PEPFAR program that you can count on over a number of years and one that's always kind of on the verge of some controversy about whether it's going to be extended just year by year.
Senator, thank you for the question. You are correct that it is important to be able to plan out. Health outcomes take time. You don't immediately get to the 95 goals right away. And so it is helpful to be able to plan out. I think the key with the program is a continued investment and engagement by the embassy in support of it. And it is a cross-agency program. So I think that's also a powerful symbol as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. In terms of the long term, it's important to also think about the fact that we have global partners. We're the largest investor in the Global Fund as well, providing grant assistance to most of the nations that engage in PEPFAR programs. There are different ways we can talk about sustainability. It's certainly an element that we should be engaging with our host governments with, and this would be a top priority of mine, if confirmed, to work with the government of the Kingdom of Lesotho to find a better pathway long term so that those investments can be met. The goal of achieving epidemic control is that there are less new infections to worry about within the broader populations. And so hopefully with those investments we make over time, we're able to focus on prevention rather than treatment. Thank you.
Thank you both for your commitment. And just for the audience here, anybody watching, Mr. McIntyre mentioned the 95, 95, 95. And just to clarify that for everyone, the UN AIDS 95, 95, 95 target is this. By 2030, 95% of HIV-infected individuals will be diagnosed and know their HIV status, of whom 95% are to be receiving antiretroviral therapy, of whom 95% are to have achieved viral suppression. That's the target that we're shooting for in the global battle against HIV/AIDS, and the U.S. investment is critical to reaching those laudatory targets. So thank you for your testimony. I hand it back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Ricketts?
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to pick up right there. I am very proud of the work that this committee and Congress has done on the prescription drug pricing issues, the Inflation Reduction Act capping insulin, capping and then progressively reducing out-of-pocket costs for folks under Medicare Part D, negotiated pricing. Supported all of those things. The great thing about the IRA, it passed by one vote, so I'm telling everybody I was the deciding vote on all of these matters. We were all the deciding vote, all of us who voted yes, and some of those provisions weren't loved by the pharmaceutical companies, but I voted for them, and I'm proud of them. But I have come to conclude, along with a number of my colleagues, that the focus on pharmaceutical companies is something I support. We're letting PBMs get away scot-free. One company, one industry researches, one doesn't. One industry produces life-saving treatments, one doesn't. One industry is super-duper profitable and another one profitable. The one that's the super-duper profitable is the one that's not doing any research and not producing any life-saving innovations. One industry is under fairly intense scrutiny by this committee in Congress, and one isn't, and it's the one that's the super-duper profitable one that is not researching and not producing products that is getting away scot-free. In May of 2023, we passed a great bill out of this committee. I think it was actually 4 bills, and if I remember by memory, I think the votes were 18-3, 18-3, 19-2, and 20-1. Overwhelming bipartisan bills, finally, to regulate PBMs. And I'm disappointed that those bills haven't gone anywhere. I turn on my TV and I see the PBMs running all kinds of ads against Congress, telling Congress, not to vote for the scary PBM reform bill. If we're going to bring prescription drug prices down even more, we shouldn't let up on having Mr. Jorgensen and other CEOs here and pressing them, but we got to get serious about the PBM reform piece of it. Mr. Jorgensen, you were here. I'm just going to go into this. You were here in May of 2023, and I asked you a question about the connection between list price and formulary placement. You and I will say, Chairman Sanders, this was the single best hearing I've attended in 12 years in the Senate, the hearing where you had both the PBMs and the pharmacy CEOs together, because you're familiar with the phenomenon that everybody blames the party that's not in the room. We had them all at the same table. You and your 2 CEO colleagues testified that PBMs prefer the drug with the higher list price, and it's difficult, if not impossible, to get a formulary placement for a drug with a lower list price. And that's because they often make a profit on the discount or rebate they can negotiate off a list price. And this perverse incentive artificially keeps drug prices too high. So then I followed up and asked this question to the PBM witnesses. And I asked about this. And as you might expect, they were not direct in their answer. I asked one witness, quote, "So you do not have any fee structure in your company where you collect a fee based on the percentage of the list price?" The response I received after a long pause, "We certainly may have a few in our client base." Everybody in the room knew that answer was a complete dodge, and that was over a year ago. Senators Marshall, Tester, and I have been working for over a year on a bill that would address this issue. The Drug Act would delink the list price of a drug from PBM profits in favor of a flat fee. We had hoped that might have been included in the markup this Thursday. I'm sorry that it won't be, but we're going to continue to make it happen. Color me skeptical that an industry that is now giving us pie-in-the-sky statements about what they're willing to do, but that's also buying advertisements on TV trying to attack Congress for doing PBM reform. Color me skeptical that they're going to come to the table and suddenly, have a conversion experience and start doing the right thing. But I guess one evidence of whether they're doing the right thing is, since you were here in May of 2023, have PBMs changed their practices, or are they continuing to favor higher priced drugs on the formulary and make it difficult to put lower priced drugs on the formulary?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. We have not seen a wide uptake of the insulins where we lowered the price. They can always find special formularies where they're present, but we have reduced access to those insulins compared to other insulins. So, like you, I'm also a bit skeptical, but I'm willing to explore the opportunity of what we can do together, all of us, to benefit patients living with these diseases.
As a general matter, you might think if the PBM saw the Help Committee vote a bill out to the floor that was going to put some significant regulation on it by an overwhelming bipartisan margin, they would think, man, maybe we better improve a little bit. I see no evidence of improvement. I see ads on TV attacking Congress and telling them not to do PBM reform. So I want to get the balance right here. I'm going to continue to vote with this committee to focus on pharmaceutical companies and bring down prices, and if the pharmaceutical companies don't want to negotiate for prescription drug pricing under Medicare, I stand with those who think negotiation is a good idea. But we're letting a huge part of this problem that afflicts the everyday American who's trying to afford prescription drugs, we're letting them go scot-free. And we've got a good bill on the floor right now that I think with some improvement could do a great job, and I hope we'll take it up, and I hope we'll devote the same attention and focus to the PBMs as we do to the pharma companies. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Senator Brunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had so many discussions like this, and I wish I had a big something to hold.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I love walking in and seeing the title of the hearing, Bipartisan Senate Budget Committee Hearing. And I appreciate that this has been a hearing and a discussion with witnesses who are really trying to explore an opportunity that has a real upside that is going to need some planning and investment. In Virginia, there's 100,000 electric vehicles on the road in my Commonwealth of 8+ million people. And those who charge at their home pay about $1 a gallon. That's what folks in Virginia are paying if they charge at their home. We need to have some advances in charging in Richmond, where I live. A lot of people don't have driveways, apartments, or multifamily communities, so more curbside, rest area. We need to make sure in the deployment of charging technologies, we're not just looking at passenger vehicles, but we're also looking at trucks. Every Volvo Mack truck that you see on the road in North America is made in Dublin, Virginia, which is in Appalachia, about 3,000 workers there. In the last 10 days, the DOE announced a $208 million investment through the Inflation Reduction Act to match an equivalent investment by the company to expand electric vehicle production. I would encourage, if anybody ever wants to do something fun, come with me to Dublin and drive an over-the-road Volvo Mack truck on their test track. It's about a 3-mile test track. You'll get in that vehicle, and it's so smooth, you think you're going 35, and I looked down at the speedometer, I was going 65. The point about fatigue was remarkable. A diesel truck just has this kind of low-grade rattle that really takes a toll on over-the-road drivers if they're in that truck for multiple hours a day, whereas the electric vehicle is as smooth as can be. And so it is going to be a kind of a fatigue health improvement for those who are doing this job. It's hard to recruit enough over-the-road drivers now. I think this is a technology that might make it a little bit easier. But in addition to the $208 million investment into the Volvo plant through the IRA, there's also been the announcement in the last year of a $100 million investment through DOE to a company called Microporous, a company that will manufacture separators for lithium-ion batteries that are necessary for the EV supply chain, and that is likely to land in rural Southside Virginia near Danville. Both Dublin, Virginia and Danville, Virginia are in economically hard-hit parts of the state. They're both in rural Virginia. Talk a little bit about how the growth of an EV supply chain could be a powerful economic development tool for rural America.
Thanks, Senator. I mean, look, my father's from Youngstown, Ohio. I grew up in Oregon in the shadow of the timber industry and forest products industry that had decayed, during my childhood. I've been hearing, politicians talking about bringing manufacturing jobs back to America literally my entire life, right? And we're finally doing it, right? We're seeing those investments now across, EVs, clean energy, batteries, semiconductors, et cetera. So we're already seeing over $140 billion of announced investment in battery manufacturing and supply chain capacity across the country, and $57 billion in EV manufacturing. That's since the infrastructure law passed. That could support over 240,000 jobs. And we all know these are more than just the direct employment, right? These are anchor employers in these industries or in these communities. And the vast majority of those are located in rural and ex-urban communities or communities that are designated as energy communities by the Inflation Reduction Act. So these are exactly the communities that are seeing a renewed economic future.
Say that last piece again.
Yeah, so
the vast
majority are in rural and ex-urban areas, and the energy communities that have traditionally relied on fossil fuel extraction, processing, or transportation that were designated by the IRA.
This is a hearing about electric vehicles, but the same week that the announcement was made about DOE supporting the manufacture of electric over-the-road vehicles in Dublin, there was also an IRA-driven announcement of $100 million to a facility that is opening up in Chesapeake, Virginia, which is in the Hampton Roads area, metropolitan area, but it's going to manufacture in the United States for the first time the cables that connect to offshore wind and put the power into the grid. All of this has been manufactured overseas because we didn't have an offshore wind industry. Now, because of the IRA, we will be manufacturing those cables, and not just for use in U.S. offshore wind. Those cables, and the company is a Korean company that's investing in Virginia, will be manufactured in the United States and then sold to offshore wind development all over the United States. Just another example of an IRA success story.
Okay, now here's a personal story that's embarrassing. I got stuck in my car for 27 hours in January of 22, driving from Richmond to DC. And it was 18 degrees when the sun was up. It was colder overnight. And it was a freak snowstorm, and the signs on the highway said proceed with caution. They didn't say turn around, go home. They said proceed with caution. I proceeded with caution, and I was stuck for 27 hours. My senior senator, Mark Warner, said I would have gotten SEAL Team 6 to come out and get me. You sat there with a Dr. Pepper and an orange for 27 hours. There was a lot of concern about what would happen to electric vehicles. I had, in a gas vehicle, I had to, run the engine for 10 minutes with the heat at full blast, turn it off until the car got too cold an hour later, and do it again to try to take my half tank of gas and make it work. And there was a lot of questions about what would happen to electric vehicles that night. And I've never introduced into the Senate record an article from Kelley Blue Book, but I just thought there's the first time for everything. Kelley Blue Book did a study. They reached out to people who had been stuck in that snowstorm, who were driving Teslas or other electric vehicles. And they found out that they actually performed better than gas vehicles, and that the way electric vehicle engines work, you can operate just a small portion of the engine that runs the heater. You don't have to have the engine running for the whole car. It does drain the reserve, but very slowly. When finally the traffic started to move, it was blocked by the fact that so many vehicles had run out of gas that even trying to move on the ice-driven roads, you were kind of like a Jenga game. You were kind of moving here, there, and everywhere to kind of get around them. But it turned out that the electric vehicles performed quite well in those adverse conditions. And so, Mr. Chair, if I could, let me introduce this article from Kelley Blue Book, I-95 Traffic Nightmare, What If You Were Stuck in an Electric Car for 24 Hours, into the record.
Without objection, it shall be entered into the record.